In the world where he lived, new dungeons were constantly appearing. Some of them were called caves and were inhabited by various creatures. Others of them were called labyrinths, and their inhabitants were quite unpredictable. Once upon a time, a dungeon called the Trial Tower was created. It was also called the Great Dungeon World. Each dungeon contained many treasures. It was the adventurers in the next dungeon that gained wealth and fame. However, becoming an adventurer was not given to everyone, and only a select few could get such a chance, and this guy managed to get it. He walked along the path and carried a huge bag on his shoulders. The guy was heading to another dungeon that he wanted to explore. His bag was tightly tied so that nothing could fall out along the way, and on the bag itself was visible a distinctive emblem. After walking forward a little, the guy met a guard who looked at him with great suspicion. Without greeting, the guard warned that there was a dungeon in front of the guy, and entry was only allowed to those who had received the appropriate permission. The guard asked the guy who he was, and his gaze immediately fell on the medallion hanging around the guy's neck. The guard immediately guessed that there was a courier in front of him and decided to check it out just in case. Sleep did not smile and clarified that he was a dungeon courier and had a porcelain rank. The guard was surprised by the circumstances and thoughtfully scratched the back of his head. He sighed heavily and, looking at the wanderers sitting around the fire, began to complain about the times when the courier arrived later than the adventurers and about the fact that the youth had become completely lazy. The boy apologized and explained that he had gotten lost. The guard asked in response why the courier was alone. The other porters were not visible, and besides, he had to pay 50 gold to the Courier Association to follow him into the dungeon. An awkward smile appeared on the courier's face, and he asked to be allowed to introduce himself and said that he was the courier for 50 gold a day. The guard applauded the fact that there was only one porter and for such a sum. When the guard finished applauding, he loudly shouted that he was being taken for a fool. He repeated that this dungeon was such that at least 4 or 5 couriers were needed, and the guy himself could not carry everything. The guard waited for an explanation of how the guy was going to drag the loot from the dungeon alone. He crossed his arms in front of him and looked menacingly at the courier. He was sure that the courier would not be enough even for one of their loads, and the guy was definitely cheating him somewhere. He didn't give the courier a chance to justify himself, asked him not to bother anyone, and to return to the association for his friends, threatening that he would make the association answer for this. The courier looked thoughtfully at the cargo and was surprised that as many as 4 couriers were laying claim to it. But the guard repeated that the boy himself would not carry it. The boy thought about you that such a reaction from adventurers was a common thing, because it's not every day that you meet a courier who takes 5 times more than usual. He grabbed the strap of his shoulder bag, realizing that in situations like this there was no point in explaining. It was much easier for him to show what he was capable of, and he threw his bag on the ground. He immediately began to load all the cargo offered to the guards into his bag. He didn't miss a single thing, filling his backpack to the top with a wide smile. No one could utter a word and simply watched him in bewilderment. One of the wanderers stood up and hissed with obvious teeth, asking what the boy was doing. The courier, not paying any attention to his irritated look, shouldered the bag, indicating that everything was ready, and asked if the wanderer was being asked about his magic bag. The boy was immediately surrounded and began to pester him with questions about his bag. Everyone was interested in whether the boy was heavy and how comfortable it was to carry the entire load, openly envying his thing. The courier laughed, apologized, explained that it was a unique bag and no one else could use it, and then expressed hope that now they should have no doubts about its capabilities. One of the men asked the others not to cause a fuss and to calm down. He was slightly indignant that his partners were acting as if they had never seen bottomless bags. The men immediately began to apologize to Mr. Jeffin. Jeffnam was a swordsman and leader of the Dawn Wolves. He handed the courier a paper and said that he was accepted. Flexing his fists, he indicated that he would accept the courier only on one condition. He served in hand and pointed out that the courier must justify his price. If he cannot work for 5, he will answer for it. The courier looked at him with disdain, thinking to himself that this guy was the leader of this whole team of adventurers who were nearby and looked quite stern. Jeffnam commanded his squad to prepare their equipment and get ready to leave soon. The courier smiled, thinking that the leader's strictness was even for the best. The courier considered himself a professional and thought that nothing would bother him, also such strictness from a stranger. The squad of Dawn Wolves moved forward into the dungeon, and the boy courier trudged after them. The boy was sure that the squad members would really like his abilities and bottomless bag. Entering the dungeon, the boys had to light torches. The boy received much more money than other couriers, but the reason was not only his abilities. It was all about the adventurer's satisfaction rate, and he was confident that this expedition would also be top-notch for him. Adventurers clearing dungeons faced many dangers. The traps that could appear at any moment were well hidden, and this was worth taking into account when setting out on such a campaign. Also very dangerous were sudden attacks by the inhabitants of the dungeons. The Dawn Wolves squad also had to deal with some less than hospitable creatures. Jeffnam was very brave and led his squad into fights, knowing that victory would be on their side. The men, who were weak-willed, obeyed him and gave it their all. Despite the belligerence of the underground peoples, you managed to repel their attacks. The dungeon's toothpick required preparation for many surprises, and Jeffnam tried to live up to it. He was angry because no matter how you look at it, it was a huge stress. He was indignant at the members of the detachment. I remind you that he asked them not to lose their vigilance and called them names in every possible way for not being prepared when they were attacked. The men began to argue among themselves, blaming each other for being scolded by the leader. The courier watched them silently, but did not interfere. He had his own opinion and his own plan of action from which he did not deviate. After waiting for the right moment, he smiled broadly and addressed the squad. The boy dropped his bag on the floor and began to untie the knot on it. He noted that everyone must be hungry from the constant fighting, and suggested that they take time to have a snack. They looked at the guy with distrust as he rummaged through his backpack. They were able to immediately understand what exactly he was taking out of the bag. Well, the smell around was amazing. The boy took a plate of cooked meat and vegetables out of his bag, and the men were very surprised where he got such rich food. The courier stood silently and smiling, holding meat dishes in his hands. As if by a snap of the fingers, a table set with various dishes appeared in the middle of the cave. This was one of the courier's special skills. The men immediately pounced on the food greedily as if they hadn't eaten for several days. They stuffed their mouths and were surprised that not only was there a lot of food, but it was also hot, as if it had just been prepared, and even the salad was fresh. One of the men noted that after a week of crackers and dried meat, this table was simply magnificent, and tears appeared in his eyes. Another was surprised that the boy's bag kept food so fresh, and another joked that he assumed it didn't have a built-in cooking function. Curio laughed and noted that in fact it was something in between what was stated and pointed out that it was too early to be surprised. He ran back to his bag and started rummaging around. His hands sank deep into the bag as if into an abyss. It seemed as if the bag was filled to the brim with water, like a portable lake. He took a hose out of his bag, and hot water immediately began to flow. This was another one of this guy's skills. Baths appeared nearby in which, as if by a snap of the fingers, all the members of the squad found themselves. The men felt better than ever, having eaten a delicious and hearty meal, and found themselves in a hot bath in the middle of the cave. Before them, it was comparable to a resort. They felt like they were in a hot spring in the middle of a snowy landscape. Although the view was actually different and the ledges were spread out before their eyes, they really wanted to dream. But the leader of the congregation, Jeffnam, did not appreciate such an act and only became angry. He cursed and shouted that everyone was making fun of him because they were in a dungeon and there was no point in fooling around here. But feeling relaxed by the hot water, he quickly calmed down and justified his words, that after all, the goods could not be wasted and they should have bathed. Leaning back on the edge of the bathtub, Jeffnam said out loud that at this rate they wouldn't even have anything to complain about because the boy was pleasantly surprising them. He admitted that they wanted to screw the association, but few were able to provide decent services for 50 gold. He thought they wouldn't be able to return the money and all that, but now it seemed to him that 50 gold was even cheap for the service they had provided. Meanwhile, the courier sat down near the fire and warmed his hands. He joked in response to the leader's words that if they had to clear the dungeon, then only in comfort. He went on to say that outsiders thought that the difficulty of the dungeon depended on the strong monsters, but in fact, the most common cause of failure was stress and unexpected factors throughout the process. He cited the example of poor nutrition, which could lead to indigestion, as well as lack of sleep, due to which one might not notice an attack and dodge, and noted that such stories are heard quite often. The boy then went on to say that the courier in the dungeon essentially depended on the adventurers, and in order to get the adventurers' money, they had to successfully clear the dungeon. As a result, he smiled and noted that he was doing everything possible to help adventurers, although he did not consider his abilities to be that outstanding. One of the squad members lying in the bathtub caught his breath, which was knocked out by the hot water. He turned to the boy and said that calling such abilities insignificant was excessive modesty, because such service is difficult to obtain even from the outside, and noted that this was something new for him. After such care, he felt a surge of energy and seemed able to cope with any enemy. The boy only smiled modestly in response to these words, glad that he was able to please them. The man got up from the bathroom, pointing out that no one should worry about clearing the dungeon. The boy Alish managed to turn away so as not to see him naked. As promised, clearing the dungeon went very smoothly. Initially, it was an experienced team, so they quickly dealt with monsters. But the problem was with the boss. The beads were always unpredictable and difficult to handle, even if they didn't look so harmless from the outside. Jeffnam, as soon as his squad reached that very boss, drew his sword again, and his face expressed annoyance. "I started my opponent," he swore. "Let's note how difficult the boss was." He shouted to his men not to give this monster a second's breath and to attack him. It was a huge lizard. Its size was tens of times larger than that of an ordinary person. He had a lot of strength, and with just one touch he could knock down any of the squad. He was attacked with swords and a bow, trying all possible options. Having released another arrow, the man threw a net on the monster, beautifully special with skill, like an archer. The monster did not expect this from her enemy and was at a loss for a second. The monster tried to get out of the web of the net. Well, once the urine with its tail and paws in different directions. The squad tried to hold on and defend with their shields, not allowing the monster to knock anyone off their feet. The leader of the squad, having gotten as close as possible to the monster, swung his blade, wanting to cut the monster down and gain victory. But despite the fact that Jeffney managed to cut off part of the monster's tail, it did not retreat and continued to fight. Having lost his tail, the lizard only became more angry and fire began to burst from his mouth. A wall of fire fell upon the squad, whose members immediately scattered to the sides. Leader Jeffnam was unhappy that the lizard had not yet fallen dead from his wounds, but continued to fight for his treasures. The courier did not get involved in the fight but tried to stay away, hiding behind one of the huge stones. He immediately realized that the boss was the Zarkum lizard and had an 8th difficulty level. The courier thought that judging by the skill of the adventurers, the probability of clearing this dungeon exceeded 80%. Well, even with such reliable chances, the remaining 20 could not be ignored. He understood that if the adventurers died, he as a courier would receive nothing and would be in a dangerous position, and therefore defeat was unacceptable. With these thoughts, he decided to help the squad and began to rummage through his bag looking for something. He tried to feel around in his backpack for what he needed, among the huge number of different objects that he carried with him everywhere. Soon he finally managed to find what he needed, and he exclaimed joyfully. Holding the unusual mushroom in his hand, the courier thought that the adventurers had enough attack power. If they created an opportunity for an attack, it would help them in the cleanup. The courier looked at the mushroom and remembered how expensive this smoking mushroom was, and he even felt sorry to waste it. But he had no choice, as the priority was to clear out, and he began to swing the mushroom, gaining the necessary speed for the throw, and all he had to do was hit the target. He watched the lizard closely as it continued to dart from side to side in an attempt to get rid of the robbers. Jeffnam took most of the responsibility upon himself and was closer to the lizard than anyone else. The courier rushed forward towards the monster and the leader of his squad. The boys only had to catch the moment when the lizard attacked the adventurers to do their job. And choosing the right moment, he threw the smoking mushroom at the lizard. The mushroom came very close to the monster and exploded, enveloping the monster in a huge cloud of smoke. The lizard began to cough very hard, and the squad began to surround him, using the courier's help. Jeffnam turned around and called out to the boy. The courier held something else in his hand, and the leader gave the command that it was high time to use it. Jeffnam smiled excitedly at the courier, already anticipating their victory. Hearing that the courier understood everything, Jeffnam began to climb up the lizard, climbing up the paws onto the tail, and from there onto the back. Jeffnam approached the head of the monster, which could no longer resist. Jeffnam jumped high and swung his sword. None of the squad members felt pity for the creature that was crying from pain and insults. When the lizard felt someone running along his back, he froze, but he could no longer do anything. Jeffnam acted very quickly, demonstrating his professionalism and skills to the maximum. He plunged his blade into the lizard's face, and it fell dead to the ground. Jeffnam remained in the same place for some time. I want to make sure that the lizard was really finished. After which he stood up and, smiling at his squad, thanked them for their good work and asked them to take the loot. Clearing the dungeon went without any problems, but the joy from it was short-lived. The courier felt how tense the atmosphere had become, and the reason was that the reward was pitiful. The boss should have dropped at least 20 B-class magic stones, but only 5 fell out and the rest were useless things considered junk. In addition, the dungeon was filled with ordinary goblins, whose presence made it very difficult to move forward and could not lift the mood. In other words, if you compare the costs of the cleanup with the rewards received, there were many reasons to be upset. This dungeon expedition turned out to be a complete failure, as it did not at all pay off the time, effort, and coin costs. On top of everything else, the reward received had to be divided among 4 people. It was for this reason that the atmosphere became very tense in a matter of seconds, as everyone began to think about competition and personal gain. The joy of the cleanup disappeared. The situation became tense. The squad members began to argue among themselves, as each wanted to receive the reward more than his partners. When it came to dividing up the spoils, the spirit of camaraderie immediately disappeared. The courier, watching the squad's arguments, smiled broadly at the moment. He believed that the adventurers' problems did not concern him, because couriers received a fixed payment no matter how much they earned. He decided that before the situation became completely heated, it was time to finish, and, calling out to the men, he took out 2 bottles of drinks. He noted that they had worked very hard and were probably thirsty and offered them a glass of the drink. It became very quiet in the cave, and all the members of the squad stared at the boy. Jeffney liked this proposal, and he noted that even in such a situation, the courier continued to take care of them. He approached the courier and started talking about the smoke bomb he had thrown at the boss, and admitted that the biggest success in this dungeon was meeting him. The boy was embarrassed and replied that he was probably being overpraised. He said that he had only helped a little with his modest skills, not wanting to brag too much. Another member of the squad approached them, expressed surprise that the boy called his skills modest, and pointed out that the more they looked, the more amazed they were by his strength. What amazed him most was that so many amazing things came out of the courier's bag, which came in very handy. Jeffnam smiled very strangely, noting that the courier's bag probably contained much more treasure than the dungeon. They believed that the boy had managed to accumulate quite a decent fortune and was trying to hide it. They didn't care that the boy was just a porter who received 50 gold pieces. The whole squad began to surround the boy. I repeat that the greatest success in this dungeon was meeting him. It was not difficult to guess that they all wanted to rob the boy, having made sure that there were a lot of interesting things hidden in his bag. The courier of the crepe clutched the bottles and tried to hide his excitement, but did not hide the fact that the atmosphere was becoming stranger to his feelings. Suddenly, one of the bottles was knocked out of his hand. Turning back to see what had caused it, he found an arrow sticking out of a pile of underground rock, which had knocked the bottle out of his hands, although it was more likely that the man who had fired it had simply missed. Another arrow followed, and the courier no longer had any reason to hide his fear. He miraculously managed to dodge it. He was saved by only a few millimeters, which was enough for the arrow to fly past without hitting him. Having lost his balance, the boy fell to the ground. Seeing that a rifleman from the detachment was approaching him, he began to loudly complain about what these villagers were doing to him. The shooter, through his bestial grin instead of a smile, ironically apologized. She didn't explain further that she wanted to shoot him in the head so that he wouldn't suffer, but she just scared him, thereby ruining everything. The whole group approached the courier. I note that adventurer was a profession. It was not worth risking life. It was unfair to pay for such a risk only with garbage. Another man from the squad noted that they had no extra motives for this robbery, but if they do not repay their debt to another person, they will get into big trouble. The entire squad stood up and advanced on the courier, convincing him that he didn't need so many things anyway, and that they would be of more use to them. The courier realized that they would not be able to part ways amicably, and that he would have to protect you. He began to rise to his feet, knowing exactly what his next steps would be. The work of porters in the dungeons was also associated with the constant risk of death. If the squad members kill him and say that it was the work of goblins, then no one will even think to suspect anything strange. No matter how much the courier tried to help the adventurers, they still perceived him as a tool and nothing more. And those who had previously appreciated his efforts, a moment later looked at him as prey. But the courier was used to it, so he was no longer surprised by this and did not lose his composure. He understood perfectly well that in his world such behavior was commonplace. In such a world, your class was determined from birth. Couriers were the lowest of the classes and were always perceived as such. This has been the case since time immemorial and has remained so to this day. But something changed and even made this boy's life harder. Gaining his ability to carry anything on his shoulders became a burden for him. He was always haunted by looks of complete contempt. What ability couldn't the courier register as an adventurer, since it was only intended for logistics? If a person wanted to participate in clearing the dungeons, he had to register only as a courier. Many times the boy was refused to become an adventurer and was only sent to the dungeon as a porter. The world made it clear to him that becoming an adventurer would not work and branded him as a courier. And now these people from the detachment most likely thought the same way as everyone else he managed to meet. He was ordered to empty his bag and was not even given any hope of survival. They attacked him again with weapons and a desire to take away everything he had. The courier was not to blame for this, but rather the evil souls of people who craved too much. And each time he had no choice but to defend himself. And once again, he reached into his bag, without taking it off his shoulders, for something that could help him. Another brief moment and the adventurer would have pierced him with his spear, but the courier managed to draw his sword in time and block the blow. The adventurer could not have expected this at all, and was very surprised that the boy was able to stop his spear. The courier quickly rose to his feet and rushed at the adventurer. He didn't waste a single second of his time, taking his sword out of his bag right in the middle of the jump. The last thing the adventurer saw in front of him was the hilt of a sword, which he had not even hoped to see. Despite the fact that the members of the adventurer squad underestimated their rapist, he managed to quickly deal with one of them. The archer, seeing this, cursed and loaded his crossbow. The courier ran straight towards him, and as he approached, he took an axe out of his bag. The axe flying towards him made the archer confused. The video arrows could not help him in any way. The axe that the courier threw pierced the adventurer's crossbow, smashing it into pieces. The squad leader and the other adventurer stared at the broken crossbow and were just as confused as its owner. Leader Jeffnum did not understand what was happening and was expecting a completely different development of events. He couldn't believe that Dolph, who was the first to rush at the boy, was defeated, and now their courier was a real threat. This angered the squad leader, and a real grin appeared on his face, which showed his true emotions. He cursed at his subordinates and ordered them to kill the boy, being unhappy that they were simply standing there. At that moment, the boy pulled out a hose with water from his bag, a strong stream of water at his offenders, not sparing a drop. Of course, the water was very hot and burned the adventurer's skin. They began to jump and fuss, trying to dodge such an unexpected rain. Having splashed his opponents with water, the courier continued to run towards them, continuing to take out his bag, sword, and other weapons. For him, there was no other choice but to kill his offenders and leave this dungeon unharmed. The bearer's sword flashed in the air, and the adventurer's cries rang out. It was an unplanned but very quick victory. The boy felt no pity and had no doubt whatsoever about what he was doing when he struck down his enemies. He was very good with a gun, although no one would have guessed it by looking at him. His eyes were filled with hatred, and the thirst for justice clouded all his thoughts. Jeffnum did not run to help his friends, but only watched in fear as they died. He couldn't believe his eyes because he considered his subjects to be very good warriors. He couldn't understand how a boy could deal with 3 adventurers who lived by fighting different monsters. It was impossible for him, because the boy only had a porcelain rank and could not have such skills. Seeing how many different weapons were sticking out of the rapist's bag, he couldn't resist asking who he really was. The boy only grinned at this question, realizing how much he had impressed the squad leader. Turning to him and smiling broadly, the boy replied that he was just a dungeon courier. The courier stood at the entrance to the dungeons. The members of the squad lay next to him, leaning against each other. The courier was waiting for someone, and when he heard some sound, he froze, listened, and began to peer at the road. Soon a cart appeared on the road. The sound of wheels knocking on the stones grew louder, and soon the sound of braking was heard. The courier shouted joyfully and began waving his arms, calling her to him. The carriage stopped near the boy. The doors opened and a girl jumped to the ground. She asked if the boy was the courier she needed for Nagi and explained that the guild had sent her because of a report of a crime. When the squad members saw the dungeon inspector Petra from the porcelain rank, they huddled close to each other, because before that, they considered their actions to be unpunished. The dungeon inspector asked the courier why the adventurers around him were tied up and so battered. The girl started to swear and asked what could have happened in the dungeon, but the courier, smiling and rummaging through his bag, replied that he wanted the girl to hear something. From the bag, groans and shouts began to be heard, and soon it was possible to make out a dialogue. The inspector heard the voices of the adventurers who ordered the courier to dump everything out of the bag, convincing him that he didn't need so many things anyway, and threats were also clearly audible. The dungeon inspector was amazed by such a device in the boy, and also by what the adventurers allowed themselves to do to him. After listening to everything, the girl commented that a voice recorder in the form of a bag is a completely ineffective design, to which the courier corrected her, noting that it was more likely a bag with a voice recorder function. The inspector left the adventurers and pointed out that it was clear to her in any case that they were trying to kill Mr. Nagi, and it didn't matter what format the voice recorder was in. However, she was interested in something else. The girl asked how a courier like him could defeat 4 adventurers. She was especially interested in the fact that all the adventurers, moreover, were sent with ash mushrooms. The courier was pleased with this, because he did not expect the inspector to know about such mushrooms. The inspector noted that she knew perfectly well that these mushrooms were found in this region, and that their consumption caused muscle cramps, dizziness, and a purple tint to the face. The courier smiled, and pointing out that everything was becoming clear, said that it turned out that the guys accidentally ate the mushroom stew. He went on to say that it was just at that moment when they were about to attack him, and all the symptoms began to appear, and he was lucky, because otherwise he, as an ordinary courier, would not have been able to tie up the adventurers. The courier approached one of the men and asked if his words were true. Mr. Nagi hoped that the inspector would believe his words. The girl looked at the courier, and then carefully studied the adventurers' faces again. The leader of the squad immediately stated that these words were a lie. He confirmed that they had indeed eaten poisonous mushrooms, but they had not done so of their own free will and had fallen into the courier's trap before the battle had even begun. After hearing this, the courier began to take his sword out of his bag, and approaching him, he asked whether the leader was really a gold-ranked adventurer and not a porcelain one. A sword fight began between them. Even though the adventurers were definitely guilty, their leader tried to prove otherwise and shift the blame onto the courier and punish him. Thanks to this fight, it was clear that the courier was a coincidence, because it was clear how well he handled a weapon. Suddenly, Nagi's courier crouched down right in front of the leader, Jeffnam, and sparks began to fly from his bag, as if an explosion was about to occur. Jeffnam was angry and cursed to himself because he believed that if his squad spent most of their strength on the middle ones with the boss, then some courier still couldn't defeat them. He tried to understand how this was possible and where this boy got such fighting skills from. Everything seemed strange and unreal, but it was still true, and Jeffnam had some suggestions on this matter and wanted to find out everything as it was. The courier openly laughed at him, calling him very slow and wondering how Jeffney managed to survive against that goblin. Jeffnam felt humiliated because of losing to some porter and wanted to believe that he just got them mad and took advantage of the confusion. He shouted at him, chasing him away with his bag. But the courier did not retreat, and his strength was simply amazing. But more and more questions arose about its origin. Having made a very strong blow, Jeffnam became even more angry because the courier jumped back and moreover continued to joke about him. He joked even when it seemed that he was a hair's breadth away from the deadly blade of his now enemy. Their swords burned like the sun but cut only air. Leader Jeffnam used a sword that was blazing with fire and turned out to be just like a blazing hurricane. He ran forward towards his enemy but quickly discovered that the courier was no longer in front of him. The courier giggled behind him, having managed to deftly jump away and outwit such a seemingly strong warrior. This only made Jeffnam even more angry. He turned around, cursed, and was ready to rush at the boy again. But this again did not produce any results, as the courier was able to dodge the sword blade again by crouching low to the ground. Jeffnam kept replaying their battle in the dungeon and began to guess why his squad had failed in the fight with the porter. This thought horrified him. He considered himself one of the best adventurers, warriors, and could not admit his weakness. Looking at the courier Nagi, he thought that the reason was not that the young man was strong, but that he was weak. His body simply did not give in to him as before, and the reason for this was already in this strange porter. Jeffnam felt very unwell, but he could not understand what was happening to him. The leader felt like he was going to vomit for a moment, and he bent over the ground and was forced to stop participating in the fight. The courier didn't rush at him, but simply stood and watched the suffering. The courier smiled, pretending that he had forgotten to say something. He pointed out that all the adventurers had been sent away, and that the first symptoms were beginning to appear. Nagi explained that the tree they had all recently eaten contained ash fungus, which is considered poisonous. The mushroom not only improved the taste of the dish, but also served as a kind of insurance against such parasites as adventurers. But the adventurers didn't even suspect anything bad and devoured the dishes with this mushroom with both cheeks, and were very pleased. Turning purple from the effects of the mushroom poison and from anger, Jeffnam looked at his porter. He began to growl with anger and tried to threaten to kill if the poisoning turned out to be true. He shouted that the courier had intended to hand them over from the very beginning and was apparently just waiting for the right moment. Nagi briefly confirmed that this was true. He went on to explain that it was dangerous for him, a fragile courier, to trust wily adventurers like them, but the mushrooms were just insurance, not a specific goal to get rid of them. The young man noted that whether he would poison them or not depended only on their own actions, And in that situation, he used a catalyst so that the effect of the poison would manifest itself faster. The courier admitted that after completing the task, he planned to give them a drink to completely neutralize the poison, but everything went wrong. One of the adventurers ruined everything himself, and now everyone had to suffer. He took out 2 bottles from his bag, which contained the antidote. But one of them was destroyed by the arrow that was fired at the courier, and he had to change his mind about giving them the antidote. Jeffnum, hearing this, began to shake from the anger and despair that filled him. Nagi smiled as he looked at him and noted that he still had one left. And indeed, Jeffnum remembered that the young man had another bottle in his hands when they were in the dungeon. Jeffnum thought that if he told the inspector straight away that the young man had poisoned them, it would hardly sound plausible, so he agreed with him out loud. He started to cry on display and say that he and other adventurers accidentally ate soup with such dangerous mushrooms. The adventurers could not admit that they had been defeated by the courier, and all supporting their leader began to shout, regretting the poisoned food they had eaten. The inspector glanced at them, lost her chin, and after thinking for a second, exhaled a little with some relief. She glanced at Jeffnum and noted that the whole situation was clear to her and that all the criminals would have to be transported to another place for punishment and assistance. The courier smiled and adjusted his bag on his shoulder, asking if he could go since the situation had been resolved, and was about to disappear from the scene. The emperor asked him not to hurry and offered to give him a ride to the city if he was going there, and pointed to the cart. Nagi stopped and turned around, freezing for a second. He asked if it was free because he really wanted to take advantage of such an offer. The adventurers were loaded into the cart, and the inspector and the courier sat down immediately behind the driver and set off on their journey. The girl, not wanting to sit in awkward silence, noted that she was sorry that the courier had to face such an unpleasant incident, having barely arrived in their city. The inspector apologized on behalf of the Adventurers Guild. It was obvious that this situation had upset her very much, and she was trying to somehow fix it. Mr. Nagi, once again looking for something in his bag, smiled at this and asked not to worry, pointing out that couriers like him encountered similar things every day. Watching sideways as the courier almost completely reached into his backpack, trying to get something out, the inspector drew attention to the fact that Nagi should have known, even though what happened was not his fault. Looking at the tied-up adventurers with particular anger, the inspector regretfully shared that it was unlikely that anyone would understand such things. The adventurers captured by Lord Nagar belonged to the Zarya Guild. This guild was known for its high commercial behavior in their region. If the guild members were offended, they would always pay with revenge. Having explained this, the girl asked the courier to be more careful for some time until the guild calms down. Having said this, the girl looked at the young man and was a little taken aback. Seeing that he was already hugging some animal that had crawled halfway out of his backpack and seemed to want to eat him, the girl asked if the courier was even listening to her and received an affirmative answer. The animal spat irritably in the young man's face and began to try to climb back into the bag. Nagi turned to his furry friend named Glottoni with displeasure, reminding him of his request not to show himself to her in public, because everyone was scared at the sight of her. The animal was indignant, noting that he was hungry. The inspector stepped back, asking what that thing was, and immediately began to write down a note in her notebook about the strange creature in the bag. The courier laughed and asked not to worry, introduced Glottoni, and explained that at some point he began to live in his bag and now brought a lot of use, helping to sort things in the bag. Before he appeared, his bag was a mess. But with the appearance of this creature, it was much easier to find something. But in exchange for this, Glottoni ate a bunch of magic stones and brazenly begged for another portion, and at that moment, the courier noted that after everything that happened in that dungeon, the creature probably had a lot to do and was very hungry. Nagi thought out loud, pointing out that the spoils from the dungeon were originally supposed to be divided between 4 people. Well, for the incident that happened, the entire reward went to him alone. This fact could not but please, because the courier still had earnings and his assistant did not go hungry. Nagi took out the magic stones and handed them to Glottoni, delighting him that this time he would get twice as much as usual. The little animal began to chew its treats with great pleasure and became incredibly cute in appearance. The inspector timidly looked out from behind the courier and looked at the animal, noting that she had never seen creatures that fed on magic stones before, and the courier replied that, to tell the truth, Glottoni was the first one he had ever met. Well, since he hadn't caused any harm, the courier considered it a mutually beneficial relationship. The inspector was very much surprised by this, but what was most striking was the courier's bag, which could even accommodate such a creature. Suddenly their path was interrupted. The horse stood above you and neighed loudly, refusing to go forward. The driver tried to calm the horses and make them move on, but it was very strange why the animals were so excited. The inspector asked about it. Well, actually, I didn't know. It was obvious that the horses were very scared of something. Well, at first glance, everything was calm. The courier froze. A strange sensation washed over him, and he concentrated on it completely. He began to look around. His face changed greatly. He was overwhelmed with many different feelings, and he tried to understand what they were warning about. He soon realized that this premonition indicated a breakthrough of another dungeon, but he did not understand why it happened in that particular place, and turned to the inspector. He pointed to one side to attract the girl's attention and indicated that behind the mountain a dungeon breakthrough could be felt. And indeed, a very bright glow was proudly carried about. It could not be compared with the sun, which seemed much dimmer than this color. The inspector, hearing this, became even more agitated and asked again if she had really heard what she had heard. The girl noted that in this case things were bad, and asked how the courier could have found out about this, asking directly if he had any magical devices for detecting such things. The courier, without taking his eyes off the horizon, said that he simply had a peculiar intuition and that magical devices were of no use. The dungeon inspector was even more surprised by this. The courier, ignoring his surprise, grabbed the armrest and noticed that they had very little time left. Gritting his teeth, he pointed out that they should hurry to avoid possible casualties. The inspector looked at him with some bewilderment. I doubted whether to trust the words of some young man with an incomprehensible intuition. She too, as an inspector, was unable to sense anything, and relying on someone's intuition was clearly absurd. Nagi, practically exploding from a storm of emotions, hissed that the words were true and there really was a breakthrough in the dungeon. Gluttony, who also looked beyond the horizon, spoke about his own. He loved magic stones very much and said that he felt a huge number of them behind the mountain. For him, it was an incredibly delicious smell, and he spoke openly about it. The inspector doubted for some time whether it was worth trusting her unusual companions and whether it was really worth hurrying. Well, I decided to accept it as the truth, and the cart was driven towards the mountain. Dungeons that existed for too long sooner or later began to change. Over time, such dungeons entered a state of so-called breakthrough, and monsters from within burst out, dreams of chaos and death. It was for this reason that people were obliged to clear the dungeons in their world. Quite quickly, the carriage reached the designated place, and the inspector saw with her own eyes that the young man had not lied. Looking at the huge clot of energy, which was a portal for the release of creatures, the inspector concluded that the dungeon had been maturing for a long time and was about to burst. Don't turn your head, the girl looked at the courier and asked again how he could feel this from a distance. The courier did not open his eyes from the maturing portal and was ready for battle. He was filled with anger, and he said that he would not be able to forget such a feeling as breaking through the dungeon. At the very least, he believed that such a feeling simply could not be forgotten, and was transported far into the past to the moment when the dungeon burst. Real demons began to burst in from the earth. During each of the breakthroughs, a real hell arose on the earth. The inspector looked at the young man and began to guess that, to his great regret, he had experienced a breakthrough. Well, even if he had survived it, the girl couldn't understand how he could feel what was happening. Her thoughts were interrupted by the courier, who noted that something still didn't add up. He looked around and said that if the dungeon was located so close to the village, the adventurers simply couldn't help but clear it out. The inspector looked at her notebook and confirmed that her notes indicated that this dungeon had been taken into work, and the courier asked if she could clarify who exactly had cleared it. The inspector indicated that the D-rank dungeon was ordered by one mithril-ranked adventurer and 2 copper-ranked adventurers. The Nagi found this very suspicious, because why would a mithril adventurer decide to go into a normal D-class dungeon? There was clearly something wrong with the whole situation, and it was worth sorting it all out. He turned to the inspector and said that he was going down to the village to check something, and offered to go with him. The girl timidly asked if he suspected the same thing, because she herself had thought the same thing. The inspector turned to the driver and asked if he could escort the criminals to prison instead of her. She pointed out that, as the dungeon inspector, she was simply obliged to go with the courier and check what they suspected. Carefully skirting the opening portal of the collapsing dungeon, they headed towards the trees at the bottom of the mountainside. The village was surprisingly quiet. They didn't meet a single local resident on the street. Walking deeper into the village, some discovered that all the inhabitants were huddled together. It seemed that everyone was very excited about something. It wasn't hard to guess that something really did happen. People were indignant that a lot of time had passed since then, and the adventurers were supposed to clean everything up, but the cart was still there. They demanded an explanation of what the adventurers would do if a breakthrough occurred. They turned to the guy and girl who tried to avoid this conversation by explaining that they didn't know anything and that they should have asked the raid leader questions, not them. The guy shouted that they couldn't do anything because the leader of the raid had just disappeared and no one could find him. People found these excuses unsuccessful, and the residents' indignation grew. The courier stood behind the crowd and listened to what people were talking about, and realized that judging by the situation, his assumptions were correct. Raid cancellations mostly happened when the raid leader's level was higher than the dungeon's level. They would register a request for a low-level dungeon, but if they found a more profitable dungeon, they would simply ignore the lower one. In this case, adventurers are no longer interested in anything and they give in to their greed and do not fulfill the contract. The inspector noted that the guild is usually fined for such negligence in carrying out the promised work. The courier noted that this punishment was still too lenient, and the inspector immediately agreed with him. Nagi understood the anger of the inhabitants perfectly well, because at any moment they could lose everything they had. Meanwhile, the adventurer who intended to allow such a situation to happen will simply get off with a fine. The dungeon that was located near this village could break through already this very night. Even if we ask for help from the Adventurers Guild, by the time they arrive, this village will already be turned into ruins. Even in such a situation, the adventurers waved it off and talked nonsense to the people. I don't want to admit my mistakes. They shouted that they had also suffered, because the leader of their raid had disappeared and they were left with nothing, and now breaking through the dungeon was no longer a concern, and people had to do whatever they could with it, but on their own. The adventurer told one of the residents, who was apparently the manager, that if he had any complaints, they should file an official complaint with the guild. They were not responsible for this and were not obliged to listen to nastiness. It was already possible to guess that the adventurers were not heroes or defenders. These were mostly people without high morals and cared only about their own benefit. But despite this, in this situation, it was the strength of the adventurers that was needed, since only they were able to prevent the breakthrough of the dungeon. At times like these, Nagi really regretted that his class was only to be a courier. The inspector thought for a moment and noted that she was very sorry. Well, the residents would have to be evacuated. Saving their lives was a priority. The courier twirled his medallion in his hands and asked the inspector if she thought these people could really be saved. The girl was a little indignant. I don't understand what the courier means. Nagi asked to listen to him and noted that winter would soon begin. If all these people lost their homes, there was little chance that they would survive such a long winter. It was obvious that Nagi was very angry. He was overcome with helplessness. He fought with himself, wishing with all his being to change the situation with his own hands, because there were no people nearby who could do it. The thought was spinning in his head that the one this village needed was definitely not a courier. Well, apart from him, apparently no one else was worried about this situation. Suddenly, he started laughing loudly, which attracted some attention. He started talking about some kind of luck that had fallen on their heads. He spoke loudly on purpose, and coming closer to the adventurers, noted that he had gone into the village for a short while, and then there was a breakthrough into the dungeons. He turned to the inspector and asked if it would be possible to collect the reward without any fees if the dungeon breach was repaired. The girl confirmed this, but did not quite understand the purpose of the question. The courier began to laugh even louder, noting that it was simply a gift from fate. The adventurers turned their attention to him. They were perplexed that some boy was going to clear the dungeon on his own. Then they noticed the color of his badge and were shocked. Nashi had a badge on his neck indicating that he was a gold-ranked adventurer, in which case clearing the dungeon was entirely possible. Nagi ruffled his hair and asked the tourists if they wanted to join him, and he proposed to divide the reward in a ratio of 9 parts to 1. Nagi decided to change the situation and become an adventurer for a while. He approached the inspector and asked what the fine was for illegally appropriating the title of adventurer. The girl replied that fines started at 1,000 gold for such a violation, which confused Nagi a little, but there was nowhere to go. The portal led into the very abyss, comparable to real hell for an ordinary person. The portal leading to the unknown dimension was a dungeon recommended only for adventurers of at least gold rank. Regular dungeons, no matter how difficult they were, ultimately boiled down to killing monsters. The monsters were destroyed, all the treasures were taken away, and the dungeon could no longer be dangerous for the cities and villages with their inhabitants. But in the abyss, the enemy was space itself, and even an experienced adventurer could not predict the conditions for completing the dungeon before entering it. This greatly increased the risk of disappearance or death, so people tried to avoid such a dungeon. Moreover, In the case of the Naga courier, the dungeon had to be completed within a certain time, which made the task even more difficult. As the group approached the portal, the inspector noted that judging by the magical limit, in an hour, the dungeon would begin to collapse and there was no more time. Everyone understood that it would be very difficult to cope with any tests in 1 hour, especially in the abyss. Nagi emphasized that they would have to hope that they would only find an easy dungeon. Saying that they had not a second to lose, the courier took the first step. He went into the portal and everyone followed him. The portal gladly accepted them and led them into the dungeon. The first thing the adventurers saw was the bright sun. The sun was blinding the eyes and everything seemed fine, but the first signs of destruction were already noticeable. The inspector was a little surprised and began to look around. There were chunks of rocks hanging right in the air. The whole group decided to take a good look around and assess the situation before moving on. The adventurer from the failed raid was delighted that it was broad daylight inside the dungeon, although it was night above. Her partner noted that this was how the historic first clearing of the dungeon of the rising star Banadeshtar began, while the girl emphasized that they must show everyone from the guild what they are capable of. The guy agreed, because when the guild sees what they were able to do, their jaws will drop and respect and admiration will appear. The inspector turned to Nagi, noting that being ignorant was indeed bliss. She thought that they were finished as soon as she saw what was happening, but in reality everything turned out to be more or less bearable. Nagi looked around properly and replied that the situation they had gotten into was not very successful in itself. On one of the largest overhanging rocks, at the top, some kind of fortress was visible and everything seemed very strange. Nagi noted that the entire environment spoke to them and welcomed them to hell. The inspector looked at the visible fortress and once again clarified the time it would take him to reach the end of the dungeon. And then the girl asked the courier why he lied to them and noted that since his intentions were good, she would not tell anyone. Nagi smiled and asked if they had any other choice in what to do. Nagi emphasized that if he had asked them by posing as a courier, the adventurers would hardly have helped them. Well, he pretended to be a gold-ranked adventurer who was difficult to refuse. He believed that even though everything was far-fetched, if the dungeon was not cleared, a breakthrough would occur, so they all ended up here together. The inspector agreed that the breakthrough into the dungeons had to be prevented, and if this was not done, the village would be in danger. But her speech was interrupted by the adventurer's yawn. She asked what was bothering them and noted that because of this, she couldn't stand slow people, stretching and warming up. Sitting down, she declared that she could have dealt with the whole situation on her own, calling it a piece of cake. She jumped onto the lowest hanging stone, and from there she jumped higher. Stone after stone she overcame very deftly. It was easy to guess that the girl just wanted to show off and win the admiration of others. Her partner shouted that her idea was quite dangerous. Suddenly, the girl's bracelet began to burn with fire. The flame began to spread higher up the arm, burning the skin with its heat. The girl was a little confused, not expecting this. At that very moment, the girl fell to the ground, accompanied by the displeased look of her comrade. He called her a fool and noted that, as always, she acted first and thought later, just like she had done back in training camp. The girl, getting up and rubbing her bruises, was indignant that he dared to swear at her. The guy didn't calm down. He didn't understand how it was possible not to scold her. The portals to the abyss could have debuffs or curses, and they had gone through this in the camp, to which the girl only chuckled and reminded that she knew this herself. At that moment, the inspector approached them, holding out her index finger, blazing with a blue flame. She pointed out that the guys were right, and in the portal in the abyss, first of all, it is necessary to check for the presence of a curse. And at this, magical shackles appeared on the adventurer's hands. When asked what was happening, the inspector explained that it seemed like this was the curse of the dungeon, and that they were now all connected to each other by invisible shackles and therefore had to move together without separating from each other. Nagi was very unhappy with the current situation and emphasized that apparently all sorts of tricks would not work in this dungeon. He dumped a lot of things out of his bag and, drawing attention to himself, said that fortunately they had a lot of mountaineering equipment. The adventurer was very surprised how so much stuff fit in his bag. Well, he ignored her question and suggested that everyone move step by step, carefully, and then they would have a chance to successfully complete the cleanup. This was the key to such spatial dungeons. It was necessary to do everything gradually, step by step, with special care. It was impossible to rush so as not to waste strength. But it was also impossible to slow down too much, maintaining an optimal pace. And in that case, it was possible to achieve the desired goal. That's what the dungeon clearing group did. They began to carefully climb the stones, waiting for each other and belaying. Nagi was ahead of everyone and asked them to follow his pace and not to forget that they were connected to chains and the distance should not be too great. So they would have to keep an optimal distance and move forward. The adventurer began to catch up with him, pointing out that he was walking too slowly and declared that she wanted to lead the group herself. But Nagi didn't like this idea and he refused, explaining that it was better to go slowly but along a well-thought-out route than to go quickly and waste time returning. Although even with the exact route there were certain problems. In the abyss, one could always encounter many variables. One could not expect when exactly one would encounter such circumstances. A huge stone animal appeared in the air in front of Nagi. The stones were covered with moss, like wool. The courier froze, examining this creature, trying to understand whether he should expect danger from it. The animal's mouth opened to swallow a huge boulder. This indicated that the entire group had to be careful because it could eat any of the stones they were on. With incredible force, the animal's mouth slammed shut, as if a mountain that had stood for thousands of years had collapsed and ceased to exist. Nagi decided that this was the first dead end on their path. The monster, unknown to him, did not inspire confidence with its food preferences. The inspector looked into her notebook and said that this monster was called a stone pig that ate stones. It was a strong monster, but not aggressive unless provoked. They lived in places with a lot of rocks. The fact that they were found even in this dungeon was surprising. According to the information in the reference book, the stone pigs also quickly excreted waste, and then a strange sound was heard, and a smaller stone flew out from the other side of the monster. The stone pig ate and excreted waste, changing the structure of the dungeon. The structure of the dungeon that the adventurers entered was incredible because of this. The courier noted that the inspector looked very pleased, that she laughed and replied that she was reacting that way because she had seen something like this for the first time. But be that as it may, they had a problem. The platform they wanted to climb on had completely collapsed. Now there was only one way to get further. Nagi decided to throw a hook onto the stone pig and attach a rope to it. It was quite dangerous because if he missed, who would provoke her to aggression? They would have to save themselves. They could not have imagined how aggressive the stone pig would become and what a danger it posed. The courier understood that they had neither the strength nor the time to deal with this monster, much less to fight. The adventurer laughed and noted that in that case, hope fell on him. He pulled his gloves higher and didn't notice that his moment of glory had come. I say goodbye to the leader of Naga. I didn't trust him very much. The adventurer asked to watch him carefully and rushed forward to run towards the pig. His name was Ban Deshtar. He was a necromancer and used his special skill, continuing to boast about how he would overcome the obstacle. He threw forward something whose structure was very difficult to understand. As soon as these clots of unknown origin landed on the pig, they turned into humanoid creatures. The creatures were segmented golems called Pebble and Cobblestone. The courier looked at the inspector and noted that summoning abilities were very rare. The inspector noted that if the summoned creature hooked the hook, it was possible to attach the rope without provoking the stone pig. Nagi immediately noticed something strange and became nervous. The golem and the creatures were shaking and spinning incomprehensibly in place. It was impossible to track how they were moving. They were literally twisted and broken. The picture was not the most pleasant and even frightening. The creatures moved very strangely with each passing second and inspired less and less confidence. The adventurer rolled her eyes and explained that in the necromancer's camp, they called him Explosive Ban. No one trusted his summoned creatures, since he controlled them, to put it mildly, mediocrely, and in the end, all his minions exploded. The necromancer was in a state of some kind of trance and asked not to be disturbed, because controlling the summoned creatures was comparable to looking in a mirror and moving the left hand separately from the right. He also warned that if it was necessary to maintain control for no more than 5 minutes, then everything would be fine. At least that's what he hoped. Nagi didn't quite trust the necromancer's abilities, but since they had little time, it was worth a try. He swung his hook and shouted to everyone that they would have to get through quickly before everything exploded. Nagi threw the hook forward towards the summoned golems that would attach it to the pig. The golems grabbed each other by the hands. One of them remained on the stone pig, and with one hand holding onto it, with the other supporting the second in the air, the tables caught the hook. The golem managed to catch the hook thrown by the courier and it sank into his clay flesh. Nagi smiled and apologized to the necromancer and asked him to be patient, since during the summoning, part of his consciousness is connected with the creatures, and he could also be in pain. Nagi was the first to crawl along the rope, thinking that although they found themselves in a very difficult dungeon, they still had some luck. The others followed the courier, The golems held the rope tightly and everything looked as confident as it could be in their situation. The abilities of the accompanying courier and adventurer inspector proved useful in this dungeon. Nagi thought that the minions were especially useful, and the chances of completing the dungeon with them would be quite easy. Even before reaching the stone pig with his group, the courier felt that something was wrong with the necromancer, although only 3 minutes had passed. Behind them, the voice of the necromancer was immediately heard asking them to move faster, and Nagi asked him to hold on a little longer, otherwise they would all fall down together. The necromancer, trying to hold on to his golems, apologized to the group and warned that the golems were about to explode. He explained that the crack that had appeared on his head had gotten out of control and that he had also started to feel sick to the point that he could no longer stand it. It was obvious to everyone that the golems were literally bursting at the seams and could fly apart into tiny pieces at any moment. This is what happened the next moment. The necromancer could not stand it and let go of control. His summoned creatures exploded. The explosion was very powerful, and now the danger from the stone pig was real. The pig's eyes immediately started to dart around, sensing what had happened. The hook that held the rope fell off the stone pig and no longer held the group of adventurers who lost such a good chance to very quietly and without problems overcome the difficulty on their way. As soon as the rope broke, Nagi and his temporary friends fell down. The fall was very high, and nothing could be heard except the swearing of the adventurers. Someone shouted for everyone to try to grab onto anything, but it was only out of desperation. This fall meant that they would have to go through the entire path again, and they already had very little time to solve the problem with this dungeon. Nagi knew that if they fell back to the starting point, they would never reach the top. He believed that the first priority was to at least minimize losses and then deal with the rest. He used his special courier skill. Nagi turned his bag upside down, and it began to fill with air. Thanks to this, it turned into a kind of air cushion, which saved everyone from an unpleasant landing. The bag fell onto one of the stones hanging in the air, and the adventurers jumped up as if on a trampoline. The bag immediately returned to its original form. Nagi landed first on the stone, barely holding onto it. The rest of the group landed after him. Nagi, very worried that everything did not go according to plan, checked to see if everything was okay with everyone. The inspector thanked Nagi, almost calling him a courier and revealing their shared secret. Afterwards, the inspector quickly changed the subject to something more important, pointing out that they had lost a significant part of their resource in terms of time. It was hard to say that they would now be able to reach the summit in time. Nagi exhaled and smiled, emphasizing that they had no other choice. He seemed so focused and so confident in what he was saying that it was a great motivation for the others as well. He told everyone that he could no longer afford to adjust to everyone's endurance and would henceforth move at his own pace, which stunned his teammates. Nagi took out a special courier item from his bag, which was a sticky climbing kit, and asked everyone to gather their courage. He gave each adventurer one of these sets, noting that they would now go vertically to the very top, and asked them not to relax their vigilance if no one wanted to allow another failure. He warned that if even one of them fell, the whole group would fall after him. Nagi also warned that the closer they get to the top, the more traps and variables will arise on their way. Soon they came across a section with falling rocks, which made it very difficult for them to climb up. Further on, I came across a section with an icy cover. It was cold and very slippery, which made it difficult to grab the surface, even with the wonderful set in the bag. Later, the group of adventurers came across a section with a narrow log, along which banana peels kept appearing, making it difficult to pass. Soon the adventurer saw a flying boulder, which was quite menacing, and asked what it was. I don't know that they had entered an area with explosive stones. Overcoming level after level, the adventurers were thrown by forces. I fought with myself, not with great difficulty, but were already ready to give up. Nagi reassured the necromancer, who kept asking how much longer he had to climb, by saying that they were almost there. The adventurer was indignant that such a phrase was not heard for the first time, and she already wants to be a monster and not climb mountains, and she did not receive such a status for this. Nagi ignored her indignation and assured her that this time they just needed to be patient a little longer, and everyone would reach their intended destination. Indeed, the peak with the fortress was already very close, and there was an opportunity to take a better look at it. Having looked carefully at the fortress, Nagi noticed that the location's boss monster was most likely waiting for them there, seeing a huge dragon who was still sleeping soundly. The adventurers were very happy and seemed to have perked up when they heard this. Bandeshtar was really looking forward to his first official fight. The girl said that she would deal with the monster boss and show those guild assholes who only gave her a copper rank what was what, and she jumped up and down happily. Nagi, watching the adventurers cheer up and rejoice, thought that judging by their abilities and talents, they were indeed above the copper rank, although they sometimes made mistakes. Nagi assumed that it was probably because necromancers were despised in the guild, and the beastmen had only recently stopped being slaves to humans. At some point, the adventurers began to doubt their strength and decided that in the worst case, the group leader, Nagi, would be able to cope with the boss alone, because he was a gold-ranked adventurer. Nagi was not very happy about this, because she took the adventurers with her precisely so that they could deal with the monster on their own and clear out this dungeon. Our thoughts and the dialogue of the adventurers were interrupted by the inspector. We should wait a little with our judgments. The girl looked at the fortress and expressed her fears that something was wrong with it. She noted that the boss monster at the top was a lindworm, a snake-like dragon that could be either winged or wingless and did not have a purple color. And since the boss in front of them had exactly this color, this could only mean that the monster was already dead. The courier's eyes widened considerably in great surprise. After this remark of the inspector, the whole group saw that someone's sword was already sticking out of the monster. From this, the situation became more and more complicated and incomprehensible. But I could see the adventurer, the man who was lying on the other side, resting after a hard fight with the dragon. The man woke up after hearing a strange noise coming from somewhere nearby. Having risen, he went to the edge of the cliff to look around. Naturally, he was not very pleased with what he saw. Nagi kept his eyes on the peak and was able to see this adventurer who had gotten ahead of his group as soon as he reached the edge. There was no need to guess. This adventurer who killed the dragon was a real danger. I'll watch Nagi's group for a bit. The man decided to attack first because competitors appeared on his territory. He jumped down without any fears or concerns. He was confident that he could cope with the whole group. Nagi and his team froze as they saw the danger approaching them at lightning speed. Nagi stood in front of the entire group and took the brunt of the wind from the flight of that adventurer whom no one had lived to meet at the end of the difficult journey. The man jumped onto the rock towards Nagi and his comrades, but seemed to ignore the courier himself, rushing at the others. He just glanced sideways at Nagi with incredible anger in his eyes. Nagi didn't have time to react quickly enough to stop him, but he did notice something interesting on the man's clothes. The adventurer wore a mithril rank badge on his chest, which greatly surprised Nagi. The courier quickly realized that in this case, everything that had happened earlier was not a cancellation of the raid. The man stopped, finding himself in the center of the cliff, surrounded by the adventurers, the inspector, and Nagi, and chuckled, noting that their presence was a problem for him. The mithril-ranked adventurer then remarked that he never expected anyone to be able to enter this dungeon. He didn't just look evil. It seemed like he had real evil concentrated in him. And after he spoke about the desired breakthrough in this place, doubts quickly disappeared that it was really evil. Nagi was overcome with anger. He knew very well that in their world there were people like this adventurer, or rather non-humans. The adventurer began to warm up his hands, expressing that he did not understand why everyone had decided to complicate everything. He spread his arms out to the sides, praising himself as great, and indicated that those 4 adventurers would be considered dead during the clearing of the dungeon. His eyes were shining. He smiled at the mere thought of what would happen after the dungeon was broken through, and unfortunately, what kind of people existed who specially arranged the dungeon breakthrough. In this world, people registered in the Adventurers Guild were given a rank according to their abilities. The initial and lowest rank was porcelain or white. These included dungeon couriers, dungeon miners, guild office workers, and other professions that did not have any combat skills. The next stage was the level of a novice adventurer. It was the copper rank. This rank was given to those who had at least minimal combat ability. They were stronger than normal people, but they could not be relied upon in the dungeon. The next rank was silver. These were experienced, skilled veterans, those who could carry out their tasks in the dungeon without problems. According to the guild statistics, most adventurers belonged to this level. Above that was the gold rank. Adventurers who reached this level could lead dungeon clearing teams. This rank was reserved for those who had great talent or experience. This was the end of the standard adventurer levels, but sometimes you could meet those units that belonged to the elite of the elite. They belonged to the mithril rank. People called adventurers who reached this level gods who rose above the human race. Only those who transcended the limits of human understanding could reach this level. The adventurer that Nagi's dungeon clearing party met was one of the mithril rank. When Nagi found out about this, there was only swearing in his thoughts because he understood that things were bad. The aura of a mithril-ranked adventurer was so oppressive on him. Nagi felt hatred towards him at first sight, and it was understandable. As soon as Nagi laid eyes on him, it became clear that even the four of them would not be able to defeat this adventurer. He was part of evil. He became evil while also having such a high and rare rank, which spoke volumes about his incredible abilities and skills. Nagi turned to the inspector and asked if she knew this man. The girl replied that he was an acquaintance, since there weren't many mithril-ranked adventurers in this city. She recalled that she had previously told about the unceremonious Dawn Guild, and the person in front of them was the commander of the Dawn Guild squad. He was a berserker named Dullahan, which translated meant headless horseman. Dullahan grinned, looked at the inspector, and noted that her face was also familiar to him. And now it became clear that she was the one who worked in the guild. Dullahan spread his arms out to the sides, surprised that such a chick had forgotten herself in such a forgotten dungeon and had decided to play the role of an adventurer. He noted that she was an ordinary white woman, which made the girl very angry. The inspector took a step forward towards him, emphasizing that she also had some questions for him. She approached him in a completely formal manner and asked why he did not defend the dungeon he was in. She barely contained her emotions and noticed that the dungeon was about to undergo a rift, and preventing the rift was the first duty of any adventurer. To these words, Dullahan only showed his sly grin and laughed at the presentation of some kind of duties. He laughed very loudly, showing his snow-white and very sharp teeth, as if specially sharpened to the edge of a knife. He continued to mock our inspector and her presentation on the account of what and to whom he was obliged. Having calmed down, he said, looking straight into her eyes, that adventurers are driven only by their own interests. For example, he cited that sometimes breaking a dungeon could be more profitable than clearing it, which angered the girl even more. Nagi did not interfere, just listening to the conversation, but it greatly angered him. He understood that in some ways Dullahan was right, but innocent people gave their lives only for the desire to enrich someone higher up. Nagi never thought of adventurers as heroes or brave men, but he couldn't even imagine that such reckless scum existed. Nagi thought that if the adventurers really were going to cause a rift in the dungeon, then he would make every effort to stop it. But there was one problem with this, because of which the achievement of such a goal was in question. The adventurer was of jade rank, and fighting him head-on was sheer madness, so he had to use his cunning. Nagi intervened in the dialogue with a loud laugh. He turned to Dullahan and rummaged through his bag, noting that apparently some misunderstanding had occurred. Nagi smilingly explained that they had just accidentally stumbled upon this dungeon and decided to take a look at what was inside, and apparently accidentally disturbed him. Nagi presented a gift for Dullahan, supposedly as a token of apology. It was the famous shashlik of Master Donstor. The adventurer took the shashlik in his hands and looked sideways at Nagi, not really trusting the food that was taken out of the bag. Nagi ignored the distrustful look and asked if the adventurer hadn't gotten hungry while he was in the dungeon, and smiled amiably, begging him to try it before the shashlik got cold. Nagi tried to cheat. I can't help but think that a direct confrontation with such a scumbag was not a way out. He needed to be weakened, so we offered him to try this kebab. Dullahan, without thinking twice, sank his sharp teeth into the meat. He tasted the wonderful flavor of this dish and replied that the shashlik remained hot, as if it had just been cooked. It seemed that Dullahan even grew fat from such a glorious gift, and responded that the dish was incredible. He jumped up to Nagi and hugged him tightly. The adventurer noted that the meat was cooked evenly. The shrimp were cooked perfectly, which made the taste simply gorgeous. Nagi chuckled quietly, mentally wishing the adventurer to eat as much as he could. Dullahan did not let go of Nagi. His hand tightly gripped the boy's shoulder and he continued to speak. The adventurer leaned towards Nagi so that their eyes met and emphasized that the ash mushroom added to the sauce gave the dish an exquisite taste, and it was simply delicious. Hearing this, Nagi froze. The adventurer stopped playing and yelled at Nagi, asking me if he really thought such a cheap trick would work. It was clear that Nagi's trick had not helped and everything was lost. Dullahan decided to reimburse the payment for the food given to him and swung his fist. Nagi couldn't jump to the side because the adventurer was still holding him by the shoulder and was too close. The blow was very strong. The courier was thrown off the cliff they were on by Dullahan's incredible strength and fell down. The courier was very close to weakening his opponent a little, but made a mistake that left him and his group in even greater danger. The inspector rushed to his aid, stretching out a huge rope that Nagi was able to grab onto. The beastman adventurer was already ready to fight, despite the fact that her efforts alone were not enough. The bracelet on her hand began to glow brightly, and then small tongues of flame appeared on it, which were reflected in the girl's eyes. She concentrated her strength and rushed forward. This bracelet created an invisible chain. The other end is attached to the same bracelet and was on the hand of the emperor who saved Nagi. She tried her best to hold the two of them together and wait for their successful landing on the nearby rock. Luckily, the inspector and Nashi managed to hold on, and they ended up on a nearby rock. But now the adventurer didn't know what to do because she was still next to Dullahan and was chained to the inspector. Dullahan, approaching the adventurer, smirked that none of them could even remove the curse of the chain and called them ignoramuses. He emphasized that her group was simply lucky. This phrase made the girl very wary. Dullahan ran towards her, picking up speed, shouting that this dungeon would become a grave for the entire group. Despite the fact that the situation was very tense, the girl was still very confused, and the adventurer ran towards her. The necromancer was already running to her aid and shouted for her not to stand there like a pillar, trying to bring her to her senses with his words. There was a very powerful explosion on the platform. The smoke billowed high into the air, making it difficult to see anything through it. Emerging from the thick cloud of the smoke, Dullahan chuckled in surprise and mockery at the same time. He looked at the monster that the necromancer had summoned, mistaking it for a pathetic summoning spirit that posed no danger to him. Looking at the necromancer, he continued to mock him and called him a dunce. The young man was very angry and spent a huge amount of his power to summon this monster. Dullahan noted that he was the commander of the group who agreed to participate in the dungeon and then simply did not show up. Dullahan rubbed his chin and noted that those who decided to go to this despised dungeon were fools, and he had a lot of fun watching this whole group. I didn't consider the necromancer and the beast race representative my opponents, and I thought it was hard to imagine more useless trash. The necromancer was bursting with anger and turned to Nero, the Cosmia of her partner, and asked her not to be afraid. I emphasized that when the commander returns, there will be 3 of them against 1. Until that moment, they just had to hold on somehow and stay alive. The girl shouted that she understood everything and they took a defensive position. To this, the necromancer added that if I remain physical, then his indestructible golem will be able to hold out for as long as necessary. And after the necromancer's command, they ran forward to Dullahan. This only made him smile. He waited for them, believing that thanks to his strength, the adventurer would be reduced to a wet spot. The necromancer and Nero tried their best to distract and restrain Dullahan. Their battle could be heard far around. On another platform, a little lower, was Nagi, the dungeon inspector. The courier was lying on his bag, and the inspector was just waiting. Nagi received a blow that was too heavy for him to lose consciousness, and did not come to his senses for a long time. After a while, the courier finally opened his eyes. An involuntary groan escaped from him, indicating the pain he was experiencing. The inspector immediately jumped up to him and began asking how he was feeling. Nagi was very confused, because he was still reliving the moment when he had just received the blow. The inspector said that she had given him first aid as much as she could. The courier thanked her and asked if he had blacked out for a while and asked her to explain the current situation with the adventurer. The inspector looked up and admitted that their situation was not good at all. Nero and Deshtar the necromancer fought with all their might, but it was not clear how long they would last. Luckily, there were 2 of them there, and they could at least stretch out the time a little, holding Dullahan and slowly wearing him out. But it seemed that this man had no limits to his strength and could not run out of steam. There was a really serious fight going on between them, and it was hard to imagine that the adventurer would be able to defeat Dullahan. The girl who couldn't wait for the battle the whole way showed herself to be very good. She managed to damage Dullahan, and at least for a short time, still forced him to stop. Having shaken himself off a little from the blow he had received, Dullahan returned to the fight with renewed vigor. He easily dealt with the golem summoned by the necromancer with just one hand, even though the adventurers had placed a lot of hope on this monster. Well, there was real chaos on the platform, and from the outside it was very difficult to see what exactly was happening and who was winning. The inspector understood perfectly well and openly told Nagi that the adventurers would not last long. The situation would not change. Nagi stood up and walked to the edge of the platform, blaming himself for such a miscalculation, and said that he should have foreseen that I might not be able to work on an adventurer of the mithril rank. Nagi asked the inspector to tell him more about this guy, if he was a mithril level, who was probably famous in various circles. The inspector confirmed this. It was said that in close combat among adventurers of the mithril level, he had no equal. Dullahan had considerable experience clearing dungeons, and often came into conflict with other adventurers there, so he was well acquainted with duels at competitions of great adventurers. His technique of wielding a huge sword was special and amazed everyone. It was said that he cut an ogre in half with one blow using this technique. Nagi noted that this was good news, since at least the adventurer didn't have that sword, The more Nagi heard stories about this adventurer, the more he thought he was invulnerable. The worst part was that even if you somehow managed to defeat him, their time was still running out. Even if the target is very close, who in their case could not help them? They didn't even have time to just get to the top. The inspector examined her hand and said that if they could get rid of this curse of chains, they could split up and try to reach the top in their own way. Nagi, apparently missing something from his sight, asked about the curse of the chains that the inspector had spoken about. Many thoughts began to appear in his head, and one of them was special. They couldn't help but touch or see her after all. They were connected by this chain. It was a vulnerability because if one fell, they all fell. But it was worth looking at it from the other side. If one rises, then all the others will rise, and this can already be an advantage. Nagi thought that if he could turn the disadvantage into an advantage, it might be possible to defeat an adventurer of Mithril's level and also complete the dungeon on time. Nagi strained himself to the limit, trying to come up with the only correct plan that would change everything. He understood that at the moment he was, albeit temporarily, the commander of the group, and a lot depended on him. He thought that if he were a real commander, he would use all the cards he had. He also understood that each of his group was insignificant on their own, and using his tools, the abilities of adventurers, all these cards could radically change the outcome. He tried to connect everything into a single whole and remained in complete silence for some time. He then turned to Mrs. Petra, the inspector, and noted that with her tracking abilities, she could determine the landscape and calculate the distance to the target. The girl looked up. The distance was relatively small and it would be possible to try. She perked up and told the courier that it was easy for her and she could even make a map. Nagi smiled back at her and asked her to do it as soon as possible. That was the first thing in his plan. The special skill of a tracker was more useful for them than ever. The girl immediately got down to her task, calculating the distance and drawing a map. Soon she managed to create a map and generate a three-dimensional version of it. Nagi was amazed, holding such a stunning result in his hands, and for a short time, he was almost speechless with delight. Taking a closer look, he noted that the accuracy of the map was much higher than he expected to see. Without taking his eyes off the map, Nagi admired the inspector's skills and noted that she was an excellent and outstanding scout. The girl, a little embarrassed, noted that these were the basics, that is, the very basis of her work. Here the inspector emphasized that she had made a map, but she was still very interested in how the courier was going to use it. Nagi, smiling, explained that they would use it to analyze the monster, but the girl's uncomprehending look, Nagi explained that this battle was not a battle of man against man, but a battle of man against a monster. After the courier noted that during the clearing of the dungeon, adventurers often encountered monsters that were stronger than themselves. Nagi tries to maintain a dialogue, asked if the lady knows how adventurers manage to defeat such monsters. The girl thought about it and suggested that they could not use experience and strategy. Nagi smiled broadly at this and replied that this was not so. He explained that the secret by which the adventurers could defeat the stronger monster was in their cunning. They looked for weak points and finished the conversation suddenly from an ambush. The adventurers used all the dishonest methods, so they managed to win. Therefore, in order to distance such a monster that appeared before them, they also had to resort to cunning. Nagi jumped up, now definitely confident that luck would be on their side if they resorted to some tricks in battle. Nagi decided to use all possible options and started with a surprise attack. At that moment, it worked. Dullahan froze, even a little confused, not expecting an attack from the side. He quickly came to his senses and focused on her. He very deftly intercepted the arrow flying at him in front of his face and smiled. He thought that this was another unsuccessful attempt by adventurers to defeat him. But Nagi knew that if the ambush succeeded, such a pathetic arrow could work there too. Suddenly, the arrowhead exploded into something very long and sticky. It was one of the courier's special skills, which was a web bomb. Dullahan was slightly incapacitated by being caught in the web. He cursed, trying to free himself. He screamed that he was fed up with everything and was angry because he wanted to finish with everyone a long time ago. While Dullahan was still trying to get out of the network, Nagi also climbed onto the platform, and his plan was working for now. Dullahan naturally was not afraid at all, and only laughed that the courier was coming at him head-on. Nagi did not pay any attention to his phrase, went forward, ready to try the key from his plan. He reached into his bag again and began to take something out. This was another one of the courier's special skills, exploding mushrooms which rained down on the adventurer in good quantities. Dullahan couldn't move from his place, and for that brief moment he could only watch as these seemingly harmless mushrooms flew towards him. The ash mushrooms exploded as soon as they felt something underneath them. It was a very powerful explosion due to which nothing could be seen around. Nagi covered the entire area with a smoke screen, which Dullahan did not expect. He considered it importunity and only freaked out. We had our own minuses there, Victor Dahlia's not only opponents, but also allies. Nagi began to approach each of his partners and ask how they were feeling and whether everything was okay with them. After making sure that everyone was okay, Nagi asked Deshtar if he could summon more minions. The necromancer began to examine himself and noted that his index and middle fingers were recovering. His ring finger was used last and his pinky and thumb were untouched. Therefore, 2 creatures were available for summoning. Nagi nodded and noted that this should be enough. Nagi shouted loudly, getting the attention of all his allies, and asked them to listen to him carefully, and pointed out that there was a way for them all to get out of this dungeon. Meanwhile, the adventurer had almost completely extricated himself from the sticky web. He was really pissed off because Nagi had gotten on his nerves. He had never heard of a swordsman who fought like that, and why he didn't like the fact that he couldn't predict it. Making his way through the smoke, Dullahan suggested that the Nagi and their allies might have hidden behind another rock, which he considered a pointless attempt. Moving further along the platform, he suddenly discovered a golem in front of him. He walked straight towards him and made strange mooing sounds. Dullahan felt irritated and considered such an act of his opponent rather reckless. He thought Nagi had made a mistake by creating a smokescreen and giving himself away so clearly with the golem. He rushed into the thick smoke, thinking he would catch the enemy off guard. He was already ready to deliver a crushing blow and was breaking forward. He gathered all his strength, believing that he would now send his enemies to the grave. Considering that he had reached his goal, he did what he considered necessary and hit the target. The golem exploded and shattered into pieces, adding more smoke and visual clutter. A smile that comes with victory lit up Dullahan's face. But very quickly the smile was replaced by confusion. From the thick smoke, an ugly hand reached out towards him. And the next moment, the enemy was completely in his field of vision. But it was not Nagi, even though he had his bag on his shoulders. It was another golem disguised as a Naga. The adventurers had put a bag on it and thus misled Dullahan. As Dullahan struggled against the boulder, he wondered why the creature could speak. But he quickly realized that it was not the creature speaking, but the sound was coming from the bag. The voice was heard again. Someone from the bag was saying that he had managed to deceive Dullahan. He couldn't understand anything and realized where Nagi really was, and suddenly heard some noise from behind and turned around a little. A thick rope appeared behind, along which a man was descending. The next moment, Nagi, whom he had been looking for so recently, appeared in front of Dullahan. Dullahan looked up and finally realized that it was all a trick to distract him, and secretly climbed to the top. The adventurer began to laugh again and asked in Nagi's face, noting that this was too rude an act towards him. He looked at the boy and shouted that now that he had found them all, they would not be able to climb up the rope. Despite the fact that he himself was now in a not very comfortable situation, he was still confident that victory would be on his side. Nagi didn't think so and asked him about it, making him doubt what he said. Deshtar appeared next to him, still in control of the golem, and looking strange. Nagi, without letting go of the rope all this time, noted that I still had to hurry, since they had been noticed. But Deshtar shouted at him and asked him to wait a little. This was the first time he controlled his creatures at such a distance, but he was still confident that he had everything under control, and asked his allies not to worry. The hook with the rope reached the top. You should have caught on thanks to the necromancer's abilities. His finger was tied to the hook, which was supposed to turn into a golem once the rope could be secured. In the air, the finger began to transform, turning into a creature made of clay and stones. The necromancer was sure he could handle it, especially when he managed to summon the creature. The rope was firmly grabbed, and all that was left was a small matter. The golem jumped onto the fortress and rushed to the place where the hook could be securely attached. Gollum walked forward confidently. This was about to work out for them. The necromancer was close to their common goal. He directed his golem towards the slain dragon, and it ran as fast as it could. The hook was supposed to be attached to the dragon, and the creature ran up and jumped up, intending to plunge the hook into the body of the keeper of this dungeon. And then the necromancer shouted, calling on everyone to climb up the rope. Everything was calculated down to the split second. As soon as the hook was secured, the group began to climb up. Having done his job, Golem was no longer needed. As soon as the necromancer lost control over him, he began to swell and was about to explode. Which is what happened the next moment. Golem exploded into pieces with great force. Dullahan was still trying to resist the other golem and was unable to prevent the following events. He didn't want to believe that the boy had planned all this in order to pin him to this position and not let them interfere. For a group of adventurers, this was reckless because of the enormous risks. But Dullahan was already busy with other things. As soon as the explosion occurred, his goal became to escape from the clutches of the monster. Everyone, including him, had to leave the dungeon as quickly as possible, which gave him even more strength to crush the golem. Deshtar watched this fight and grinned, because he knew that it would not be as fast as the adventurer would like. This golem was created from a thumb and was quite slow. But the thumb had the greatest power of all. Nagi, meanwhile, rose higher and higher, repeating to himself the words that this was not a battle between man and man. It was a battle between man and monster. After the explosion, the fortress began to collapse. Everything was cracking at the seams. The body of the defeated dragon boss was showered with pieces of the castle he was guarding. There were monsters that were impossible to defeat, and Nari always remembered this. And if his goal was not to destroy such a monster, then he took all measures to achieve any other. He always followed justice and goodness. He did not wish evil on people who were ordinary residents and had done nothing wrong. But at the same time, he wiped off the face of the earth those who did not deserve to walk on it. Dullahan was one of those people. He took a wrong turn and was no longer worthy of life. At those moments, he was still thinking about his salvation. While he was thinking about this, his enemies were achieving this goal. He saw the rope and how the adventurers deftly climbed it, and with every second were further and further from the impending hell. Nagi always followed one rule. He destroyed his enemies, but they did not always die by his hand. And this time this rule worked again. He just went to the main goal and made sure that no one interfered with him. They got out of the dungeon, but Dullahan was left there forever. At the beginning of his journey, Dullahan could not have imagined that he would be outwitted and defeated by a gold-ranked swordsman who was actually a courier. Soon the group managed to reach the top, where the castle was located. The adventurers were already beginning to feel the taste of victory, but they did not relax and ran forward with all their might towards the fortress. They had very little time left. Nagi encouraged his partners and asked them to push a little more. The end of the dungeon was already visible. The adventurers were squeezing out their last strength and were unable to run. According to Nagi's calculations, there were 5 minutes left. This was just ahead, but they had to make it. Nagi smiled and shouted that the credit for their victory went to Nero, who was surprised by such a statement. Nagi explained that without them, he would not have been able to throw the rope to the top, which was more than 50 meters high, and they would have lost the chance to get out of the dungeon. It was hard to believe that this could be done only with pure force. Nagi was actually very impressed that Nero was able to do such a thing. The girl was very embarrassed, noting that it was nothing, and she only had to try a little, and everything happened almost by itself. Necromancer Deshtar wilted at this phrase. Perhaps he was a little offended that Nagi did not acknowledge his merits at that moment. He caught up with his partner and shouted that anyone could do something like that if any fool was strong enough, but Nero didn't like this devaluation of her abilities at all. The necromancer noted that no matter what anyone said, the main hero of this dungeon was he, Deshtar. He emphasized that he was able to defeat even that boring berserker, and moreover was able to hook the rope at the right point. He wanted to be admired and drew attention to his achievements in every possible way, expecting applause and gratitude. He thought that he could be safely called cooler than the mithril adventurer. Listening to this, Nero was dissatisfied. You only saw how her partner kept getting hit in the face. Nagi and the inspector, listening to the arguments behind their allies, laughed at this and joked that everything was quite joyful at that moment. Nagi guessed that for those two, this was probably their first successful dungeon clearing, which was why they were acting like that. And besides, the victory felt more vivid when everyone in the group made an effort. Nagi believed that if only one person took on all the work, the victory would feel completely different, even though he himself was only watching everything that was happening from the sidelines. Having finished reasoning about this, Nagi drew attention to the temporary huge contribution to this cleansing by Petra, although she thought that she did almost nothing. Nagi, looking at her, emphasized that he knew about the special skill of scouts associated with reading the terrain. From Nagi's observations, this was usually limited to basic skills and did not go beyond them. But he believed that it was Petra who was able to instantly create a very detailed map. Thanks to this map, their group was able to accurately calculate the location. Such work was very expensive because otherwise they could have remained in that dungeon forever. The girl was embarrassed, but she was very pleased to hear such words. Nagi appreciated her skills as a professional scout, despite her low rank. But Petra thought the opposite. She believed that their victory was due to their temporary gold rank leader, who was actually an ordinary courier. He managed to develop a plan to win so quickly. She couldn't believe he was a courier, because such a person deserved a completely different role. Having caught up with the inspector and Nagi, Bandeshtar asked the leader what would happen to that berserker. But there was no need to even ask, because for what he had done, he would have to rot in prison for the rest of his life. And it was worth banning him from being an adventurer altogether. But the inspector thoughtfully said that she really didn't know for sure how to determine the traitor's fate. He certainly committed a serious crime, but there was one problem, which was his mithril rank. The higher the rank of an adventurer, the more immunity he had to punishment for a crime, and the more free-ranking adventurers received state support. The inspector explained with great regret that there was a high probability that he would simply be issued a fine, which shocked the others. It was very unfair to both the ordinary people who could again be exposed to the risk of losing their lives, and to the adventurers who would have to fix what had happened. Bandeshtar, gritting his teeth, cursed and noted that he didn't care. He promised that even if the law was like that, he would deal with it himself outside the dungeon, which made Nero laugh a lot. Nagi, hearing this, immediately frowned and said that such a thought was very dangerous. He emphasized that they had only managed to see a small part of the berserker's power, and asked the boys to look around and note the number of corpses. He killed every last creature from the Knoll tribe guarding the entrance to the castle. The berserker killed everyone single-handedly, something that no other adventurer could have done. Nero and Bandeshtar began to be indignant, saying that they themselves could have done it. They just didn't get the chance. Without stopping for a minute, Nagi explained that that wasn't the problem. If you looked at the wounds of those who were killed, you could see that they were all killed with one blow. These words made the adventurers shudder with horror, because they had not thought of this. Nagi noted that the adventurer's special skill would manifest when he used the appropriate item. And in the battle with them, the berserker did not use either her sword or her skill, and even with her bare hands, she gave them all a run for their money. Deshtar thought about the nuances when the opponent's levels were different. Dullahan seemed to do everything lightly, while the necromancer put all his strength into this fight. Deshtar, thinking, began to understand that everything was true. I remember the moment when he sent his little finger to throw off the lindworm. Deshtar thought that Dullahan's two-handed sword had already been pierced into the heart of the monster, and perhaps he had also killed that boss with one blow. Nagi quickly sensed that something was happening to the necromancer and stopped for a moment. Turning around, he was embarrassed because Deshtar was practically crying from despair. Making his way forward, Pasha thought about what had happened. Dullahan fell along with the lindworm. With this, it turned out that he could very well get his sword back. From that moment on, it became clear that they had not won, but had simply escaped at a convenient moment. Meanwhile, Dullahan, already with his sword in his hands, listened and looked towards the fortress. He heard everything they were talking about, and he wasn't going to let it go. The real game was beginning, which would be many times more difficult and dangerous. Nagi ran forward as fast as he could, since he and his group had practically no chance of winning. He shouted to the others, urging them to hurry and be careful. They should scatter to the sides to distract the berserker a little, and not get caught in a single blow by the crowd. Just then, Dullahan was already catching up with them. His attacks were getting to the adventurers. The necromancer who ran last was the one who was able to best get acquainted with the serious attack of the mithril-ranked adventurer. It was impossible to say that it wasn't scary. The blood ran cold in the veins just from the thought that at any second Dullahan would hit the target. He used a special berserker skill. It was a giant cut, and almost no one could withstand this blow. From such force, it seemed the entire dungeon was shaking. This happened when Nagi and his companions were climbing up and were very close to the exit. Due to the shaking, Nagi was in danger of falling and dragging the others with him, because it was very difficult to hold on to the smooth rocks. He barely managed to stay on the rock. It took a lot of effort, but he also had a huge responsibility for the lives of others. He shouted down, asking for some attention. He wanted to make sure that everyone was okay. The inspector replied that everything was fine with her, but then pointed out that the problem was something else. Two of them were seriously injured. It was Nero, who was barely clinging to the rocks, even with the support of. Bandeshtar was in particularly bad shape, and it looked like he had completely lost consciousness. Nagi saw nothing good in this and could say nothing but curse. Dullahan's power was simply monstrous. Nagi looked around, trying to assess everything that was happening. They had to hurry and get out of the dungeon as quickly as possible, as the berserker was already catching up with them. He just looked like a monster to me, he really was. His eyes were glowing with madness. It was clear beyond doubt that nothing would stop him. The situation for Nagi and his group was getting worse with each passing moment. They were running out of time, not only because of the dungeon's rupture. There were only 3 minutes left, but to stop all the madness, it was necessary to at least try. Nagi understood that he was just a courier. Well, over the time he carried countless amounts of cargo. He had trained so heavy objects were commonplace for him. In terms of strength, he had a good advantage over his allies, who may not even have been aware of it. He tried to convince himself that he was doing the same job at the moment as always. He was just carrying a certain weight around with him, and he needed to deal with it again. It may have been a little harder than usual, but he tried to concentrate all his strength and began to try to lift the group members. The dungeon inspector and Nero no longer had to cling to the rocks. The girls simply hung thanks to the magical chains. Nagi calmed himself down and convinced himself that he would definitely cope and help everyone save themselves. He continued to climb upward, but with greater confidence. He dug his fingers into the smooth stones and dragged the adventurers and the inspector along with him. Nagi was successful in everything, and the group began to approach their target much faster. Nagi thought of only one thing. He tried to get rid of unnecessary thoughts and concentrated on only one. It was time. He tried to forget about the fact of the chase, the danger from the berserker, the injuries to his partners. Nagi tried to forget about the strength of Dullahan, who was jumping over the rocks as if they were low steps. He tried to forget about his power and his deadly weapon, which could leave them in the dungeon forever with one swing. He was only counting the seconds that remained until the end. It was up to Naga to decide what kind of end that would be. Through the pain, he climbed up. His hands were rubbed raw, but he forcibly forgot about the pain because this feeling could cost him his life. He made his way forward, his eyes looking only ahead, not paying attention to anything else. Having climbed the plateau, Nagi lifted Bandeshtar, who was unconscious, onto himself and walked with him while the inspector tried to support Nero. Even then, Nagi did everything automatically and thought only about the last seconds they had left. Dullahan was about to catch up with them. He was making his last jumps and would soon be at the very top. He made his last jump. He could already taste his victory. His eyes sparkled in anticipation of the death of his enemies, those who were preventing him from finishing what he had started. Nagi was moving forward with his last strength. Time was running out, as was the distance to salvation. Only a short moment separated them from either their death or their salvation. The gates were very close. There were only a few meters left to overcome. The light from the gates was scattered around. It was pleasant, like the gentle daytime sun. Nagi and the inspector had already stepped onto the threshold of the temple. It was difficult to describe what was going on in their thoughts, what they felt at that moment. And finally, they saw what they had been walking towards for so long. In front of them, in the center of the hall, a huge stone shimmered in the air, which was the core of the dungeon. Nagi's entire focus shifted to him. He no longer saw anything around him. All that was left was to destroy the core, and then the dungeon would not explode. The inhabitants of the nearby city would live in peace. Nagi reached into his bag right on the move. There were only a few seconds left before the explosion. After throwing Bandeshtar to the floor, Nagi threw the sword straight from his bag, aiming at the stone. This moment stretched out in everyone's minds because it was so decisive. A miss meant the end, and it couldn't be allowed. So much effort had been expended to get there, and so many human lives were at stake. The sword quickly covered the distance, and it became clear that it was flying straight to the desired target. Nagi could already imagine the stone exploding and scattering into thousands of pieces around. And just at that moment, Dullahan appeared, who still managed to catch up with the group. Although Nagi understood that this would have to happen sooner or later, he was still a little confused at the sight of it. Dullahan deftly jumped to the core of the dungeon and deflected Naga's sword, protecting it from damage. The moment he did, it was etched in the adventurer's memories forever. Dullahan stood in front of the stone, protecting it. It was the end for Naga and the others. The berserker straightened up and looked Nagi in the eyes and hissed that time was up. The core began to crack, unable to withstand its own power. The next moment, there was an explosion. The power of the dungeon won and began to burst out. Nagi's face was a mixture of many emotions. It was disappointment, despair, and an unwillingness to accept reality. Everything around sparkled, and the temple was filled with a bright, blinding light. Tongues of flame began to burst out. It was not just a flame, it was a real hell. The fire gave birth to something that you never wanted to see or know. It was the purest creation of evil. The city was doomed. Evil was at the gates and under the threshold of the residents' homes. The first to encounter the flames of hell was a man who was on one of the streets. Seeing in front of him that the dungeon had burst open, he fell to his knees and began to pray. Looking at the sky where one could see how the dungeon was growing, I wanted to run away. But the man remained where he was and simply prayed, because there was no point in running. Monsters began to burst out of the flames, who only wanted to establish their own order and profit. Werewolves, huge wolves, announced themselves with their howls and thirsted for the death of all living things. The monsters came out one after another. No one could stop them anymore. It was a whole invincible army of evil, the elimination of which would require a lot of resources. They were filled with malice. They were incredibly hungry, and their only goal was to bring death to the earth. Dragons burst out of the hellish flames, their cries heard for tens of kilometers around. The flame created dragons, and they in turn continued to breathe life into the fire, spreading it everywhere. Nero, exhausted from the previous battles, could not even stand up. She looked at the army, consisting only of monsters, and could imagine what awaited her friends ahead. The inspector sat next to her. The girls couldn't even roughly count the number of monsters that had respawned in the dungeon. Dullahan held Nagi tightly by the neck, and lifting him off the ground, laughed loudly. He asked him if it wasn't a wonderful sight to see the dungeon breaking apart, and noted that no matter how many times he saw something like this, he never got tired of it. Nagi noted with great difficulty that apparently this was not the first time Dullahan had caused a rift in the dungeon, and he confirmed this, and noted that the boys would not understand the essence anyway. He explained that the broken dungeon would eventually regenerate, becoming even stronger, which meant that the rewards in it would become better. Nagi was outraged that Dullahan was arranging all this hell just for the sake of a reward, not at all worried about what harm it would bring to the villagers. And he was right. Berserker didn't care at all about the fates of others who would suffer. He answered frankly that all he cared about was loot. He only thought about the reward he could get in the future. He compared the life of the villagers with the life of ants underfoot, which also did not bother anyone at all. Nagi, being squeezed in the clutches of his enemy, understood everything. He had long been accustomed to the fact that foreign tourists were not heroes and saviors. Often they were vile scum who thought only of their own benefit, and he hated them with all his heart. And when such adventurers also gained enormous power, this brought the world closer to a very bad outcome. But there was always hope for the best. There was always a chance to change everything. Although rare, there were still true adventurers who honorably fulfilled their duty and cared for the world. Their hearts were not defiled by greed. Their souls were filled with light, which they shared with others. Began to circle above the exploding dungeon. She was slowly chewing a bun. She was one of those who cared about the world and ordinary people. And then she came to fulfill her duty and defeat evil once again. She was fully prepared. It was very difficult to meet people like her. Well, it was even more difficult to meet strong ones. Having found her first target, the girl boldly jumped down from the bird. Her face was fearless. Her weapons were ready for battle. She had to destroy the monsters before the rift got bigger. She rushed straight toward the dragon, which was spewing fire into the sky, realizing what a danger this girl posed. The monster tried to fight and could also feel fear, although no one could say for sure. The army was hit by flames, but a lot of character. This fire conquered evil but did not generate it. There was no escape from it. The army of monsters that the dungeon had spawned was rapidly diminishing. It was impossible to fight the fire, and the girl herself was like a shadow, completely elusive. Some of the monsters tried to pass through the flames, but only a few succeeded. Dullahan, seeing what was happening and noticing the girl, froze. From his face, one could easily guess how angry he was and how much he did not expect this. The inspector's eyes lit up with hope when she realized that they had come to their aid. The girl quickly reached them, and Vesta landed carefully, as if nothing had happened from the jump. She called out for everyone's attention and introduced herself as Agnes Farid, Deputy Chief of Sunset Wind. The girl glanced at everyone and asked with wild indignation what had happened here. On her chest was visible the symbol of the mithril rank. The dungeon continued to spew out new monsters, which immediately rushed to attack. But from one hell, the monsters fell into another, where they quickly died one after another. Dullahan let go of Nagi. The courier was having a hard time. He bent over and tried to catch his breath and fill his lungs with air. An inspector approached him, who was very worried about his condition and began asking if he was okay. Through his cough, Nagi assured her that he was fine and asked the girl to look in the direction where the dungeon rift was located. The rift began to noticeably narrow, and the flames that were bursting out of it began to return back. There were no more new monsters to be seen. The rift was closing, although the reason was unclear. Nagi jumped to his feet. He and the inspector couldn't believe their eyes. Dullahan, seeing this, loudly clicked his teeth in anger. He looked at Agnes and noted how surprised he was that even though the dungeon was low rank, only one hit was enough. He repeated Agnes's name and her Sunset Wind Guild. He emphasized that he thought the guild had long since fallen apart, and asked the girl what she was doing in this place, since he thought it had ceased operations 3 years ago. Agnes showed everyone how unhappy she was to see Dullahan from the Dawn Guild. She pulled her sword out of its sheath and noted that judging by the sight before her, she didn't need any further explanation. She loudly said that a mithril-ranked adventurer could not fail to clear this level of dungeon. This meant only one thing. The girl was completely convinced that Dullahan had done this on purpose. His eyes sparkled with madness. Smiling, he asked the girl why she decided that she had the right to talk to him in such a tone. Dullahan had long wanted to fight the deputy head of Sunset Wind. At the moment, he was not the most suitable to fight this girl. Nagi had worn him out with his tricks, causing him to spend more energy than he expected, so there was a risk that he wouldn't be able to cope. It was because of this boy that everything went wrong for Dullahan. But despite this, the main goal for him was still accomplished. It was in his hands. A certain stone was more important than anything else. There was no longer any need for him to fight, and he hung his huge sword behind his back, turned around and began to walk away. The girl was outraged by this behavior and asked why he decided to run away. Dullahan just laughed and turned around, asking not to misunderstand him. But this dungeon rift could be too dangerous even for him, an adventurer with Mikhail's rank. At this point, Nero approached them and screamed loudly and caught him in a lie. She screamed that not only did he deliberately fail to clear the dungeon, but he also tried to kill them so that they would not prevent the rift. A new wave of discontent washed over Dullahan. He hoped that everyone would remain silent and the conflict would not continue. He smiled again and lied that he was sorry, and noted that in this dungeon there was a curse for the first adventurer to enter, which made it impossible to distinguish between allies. It turned out that according to the berserker, it wasn't he who decided to attack someone, but Nero didn't believe a single word he said and called him a nasty slug. Dullahan pointed out that if no one believed him, they could check it out for themselves, and then noted that it was a shame that the dungeon had already disappeared. He beamed with his smile, knowing that he would once again go unpunished. He openly noted that, in his opinion, the guild should accept such a report. Everyone understood that this was complete nonsense. The dungeon inspector was the one who was most angry about it. Although she had seen something like this many times before in the adventurer's court, the weight of the statement was determined not by the truth, but by the rank of the mithril. No matter how much the porcelain testified, their words were worth nothing against the mithril. Even if you told the honest truth, it would have achieved little. The worst thing was that Dullahan understood this very well and took advantage of it. Berserker was eager to disappear from the crime scene and asked if everyone thought it was time to end the conversation. Taking one last look at the adventurers and calling them greenhorns, hinting at their inexperience, he said goodbye and walked away. The inspector stood there completely confused, but the others were shaking with anger and a sense of injustice. This very tense situation was interrupted by Nashi's laughter, and he began to talk about the rupture of the dungeon. He smiled broadly and noted that the dungeon had closed after all, and now no one was in danger, and even despite everything that had happened, one could find something to be happy about. But after these words, the young man suddenly fell to his knees. The inspector immediately took notice and started screaming, trying to get an answer from him, while the rest of us simply didn't understand what had happened. Agnes Farid turned around at the shouts and was very surprised when she saw Nagi. He looked really bad. It was obvious that he was holding on with all his might and was about to collapse and disappear unconscious. He was covered in bruises and wounds. His hands were torn to the point of bleeding. The young man had lost too much strength and now he needed help. At this point, the sound of a large bird flapping its wings could be heard. It was the thunder eagle Agnanon, who landed near Agnes. The girl asked everyone to put her sister on top of him. Note that if you use it, you can get to the city very quickly. They had no other choice. The adventurers were very grateful that Agnes appeared out of nowhere and decided to help them. Thus, the grueling cleanup of the rift came to an end. The village was saved and its inhabitants could continue their normal lives without fear of any monsters or beasts. The village greeted the morning without any cataclysms. Later, the Adventurers Guild visited the village, apologized, and promised to prevent such incidents in the future. Naturally, all these were just words considering what kind of people were among the guild members. Agnes helped Nagi and the other adventurers get to the right place. The inspector hugged Nagi the whole way, trying to control his condition, but was glad that the rift was closed. With Agnes's help, Nagi went to the adventurers' city in the west of Valum. He needed help, and they could help him there. They took him to one of the buildings, somewhere in the back alleys of the city. Nest and Yuin found your refuge. It was the office of the Sunset Wind Guild. Nagi lost consciousness on the way and began to come to his senses on his bed in the office. It was with great difficulty that his eyes opened. The sunlight was blinding. and his whole body ached. When he opened his eyes, he was even a little scared to find himself in an unfamiliar environment. He woke up on an old bed. Next to him on the floor sat the inspector, leaning her elbows on the mattress, and next to him stood his bag. Nagi tried to get up, but his body hurt so much that he couldn't help but groan. He asked the inspector where he was, thinking that she had simply closed her eyes and was not sleeping. Not receiving an answer, he called the scout lady louder, and she finally woke up and opened her eyes. As soon as she saw that Nagi had woken up, she became very happy and beamed with a smile. Bandeshtar, who was already looking much better, and Nero were also in the room. They all rushed at him with hugs and started asking about his health. Nagi shared with them that the last thing he remembered was the berserker leaving. The inspector stepped back, letting Nagi take a deep breath, and explained that they were in the guild office, and Nero danced and noted that the stylish beauty Agnes had saved them. Agnes even called a priest from the church to cure Nagi. Nagi tried to move his hands and noted that apparently thanks to the priest's help, he did not feel any pain other than a little fatigue. Nagi expressed how glad he was that everyone was okay. The necromancer and Nero began to boast that everything that happened was nothing, and that they were not tired at all, which was their usual repertoire. The necromancer was most proud of the past adventure. For him, this was the first dungeon clearing, which resulted in a grand adventure, and he believed that everything went well. He began to remember how happy the villagers were when they learned that the dungeon's crack had been stopped. Then he realized what it meant to be an adventurer, and the words of gratitude from ordinary people changed a lot in him. Particularly touching was the gratitude of the little children, who gave him flowers and hugged him with their little hands. For adventurers, it was just a dungeon with a reward and glory, but for people, it was a threat to life, and it was very hard to realize it morally. Nero and Bandeshtar could barely restrain themselves from crying and from appearing to people as some kind of weaklings. They both bowed before the village manager and sincerely apologized for being rude to him earlier. Nero took his remarks and noted that she would definitely become a great adventurer, and Deshtar continued to talk about saving the village. Nagi laughed and remarked how great that was. To draw such conclusions and strive for good was very important in their world reality. Nagi was also extremely happy that the village was protected, but there was still a certain nuance. When it was all over, the courier decided it was time to reveal the whole truth about himself and clutched his badge. He was not a golden adventurer. It was hard for him to say it out loud, but it was necessary. In fact, he was below the rank of any of them. He was a simple courier. He glanced sideways at his real badge and gathered the courage to say so. He was a porcelain courier. He believed that everyone would turn away from him, and moreover, he would be punished for such a lie. He thought that the adventurers with whom he had gone through such a difficult path would not be able to treat him the same way, knowing the whole truth. After collecting his thoughts, Nagi smiled and apologized, drawing attention to himself. He asked if he could tell them something, and asked them not to be angry with him for it. The adventurers were in anticipation, but they had no idea what they would hear. Nogi told them that he hid his identity and pretended to be an adventurer, pretending to be the squad leader. As expected, their reaction was cold. Nero did not hide her displeasure and immediately changed her expression. But she still noted that in the current circumstances, such a lie could be understood. But now she looked down on Nagi, just like Bandeshtar. The connection built on lies disappeared, and they became a courier and adventurers again. As she left, the girl noted that next time she would ask him to carry her load. The adventurers headed for the exit, leaving Nagi and the inspector alone, asking them to rest. The doors to the room slammed shut. Nagi couldn't take his eyes off them for long. The inspector looked at him in surprise and asked if it was necessary to tell the truth, to which he forced out a feigned laugh, and merely noted that those two would become excellent adventurers. Ruffling his hair, he indicated that he was sure that they would meet again in this city while he was working as a courier. Looking at the inspector, who understood him but felt genuinely sorry for him, Nagi emphasized that one cannot build a relationship on lies. The girl turned to him, clenching her fist around the excess of various feelings, and came a little closer to the bed. She repeated his words, which claimed that he was not an adventurer, and noted that she had seen adventurers many times while she worked as an inspector. Most of them acted only for their own benefit and did not hesitate to commit crimes. An adventurer is not a hero or a savior, but someone who only seeks profit no matter what. After that, the girl said that she was sure that Nagi was not like that. She emphasized that he cleared the dungeon despite the fact that it did not bring him any benefit and risked himself only to save the village and did not demand any reward. The inspector, placing her hand over his, said convincingly that this was precisely why he was not just an adventurer. She sat down on the edge of the bed and took his hand firmly in hers, called him a real hero, and smiled. Nagi seemed not to be entirely pleased by these words. Perhaps he found them hard to believe. He knew what he was doing and why, and he was overcome with guilt and remorse after these words. When everyone was absorbed in the conversation between Dullahan and Agnes, it so happened that he was left behind the whole group. He looked everywhere, monitoring the situation, and he managed to notice something. He spoke out loud, trying to get the others' attention, asking them to look into the closing rift. A chest with a reward for clearing the rift fell from the rift. Nagi was very happy and hurried towards him, almost dancing. He lay down towards the chest with great joy, but the others did not hear his words and continued to listen to the conversation of the mithril-ranked adventurers. So Nagi, having given it his all, collected all the reward and fell down exhausted. The entire reward was kept in his bag, which he immediately dragged onto his bed and hugged it contentedly. He collected all the loot twice in a row and finally had a chance to realize it. The inspector was a little shocked by his behavior, but she liked the fact that Nagi was in a good mood. But Nagi never told Petra about this and decided to check the reward later. That day, it wasn't just her who was wrong in her judgments about him, but Nero and Deshtar too. As soon as the adventurers were alone, they immediately began to discuss their former boss, who turned out to be a courier. Deshtar looked at her slyly and asked if she was thinking the same thing as he was. The girl winked at him, agreeing that it must have been true. Deshtar noted that he would then say it out loud to make sure. He said that this was just a legend and that Nagi was pretending to be a porter, hiding his true strength, but in reality he was a golden adventurer. Nero couldn't help but laugh. The adventurers really thought that Nagi had decided to hide behind the image of a porter, but in reality he was very strong. The two turned out to be much more stupid than Nagi thought, and when they returned, they began to promise to keep the secret. Although given how Nagi acted during the cleansing, they could be understood. Meanwhile, on the other side, this small incident began to grow like a snowball, turning into an avalanche. Dullahan returned home and first went to see his mentor. He approached without saying a word and waited for them to speak to him first. The mentor, gritting his teeth and still not turning to face Dullahan, noted that he had heard about the interference that had arisen in the dungeon rift. Dullahan apologized to the chief for this and explained that he was first attacked by some children, and then the sunset wind intervened. The head of the department opened up to him slightly and asked if Dullahan Fee Venezlo had forgotten something. The guild leader's hood flew off, revealing a mask over his eyes. He rudely reminded Dullahan that Dawn had not sold the res, who was interfering with their boys, and it did not matter whether it was a fake adventurer or the sunset wind. Agnes Farid walked across the wooden floor, her heels clicking. The girl was thoughtful. She was worried about the latest events, as well as the information she had learned. She couldn't get what she had heard from Mrs. Petra out of her head. If this information was true, then a lot could change. Even on the way to the city, sitting on the eagle, Agnes turned to Lady Petra. The girl, based on the fact that the city was still far away, asked to tell them what they were doing. Petra, not expecting the question, at first did not understand what details were being discussed. Agnes explained. She didn't care why the inspector was there or why the man was so badly hurt. She wanted to know all the details. When Petra began to speak, Agnes interrupted her and asked her point blank whether the inspector had entered the rift illegally, which made her feel embarrassed. Agnesa indicated that she had checked the composition of the squad at the time of her arrival, and it did not match the inspector's data. This was not important, and Agnesa emphasized the personality of the conversation and her lack of authority to hold anyone accountable. Even if you were involved in something, she didn't want to delve into it. She just wanted to find out everything for herself. She was investigating a chain of dungeon rifts that had recently started happening in the area, and during these investigations she found a clue that it might be related to the Dawn Guild, and that was why she was there at the time of the rift. Mrs. Petra was interested in the fault line. She noted that she had heard about it, but did not know that it could be related to Dawn. Agnes replied that it was only a hypothesis, but she needed more information to refute or confirm it, and then Petra agreed to tell everything. She only asked to keep Mr. Nagi's illegal actions a secret, and that was the only condition. Mrs. Petra added that Agnes might even praise him for such an act. Petra told how they ended up in the dungeon and what happened inside, hiding nothing. And now Agnes was thinking about the golden adventurer, who was actually a courier, who had almost managed to clear the dungeon. It was easy to understand that if it weren't for the dog from the Dawn Guild, he would have definitely been able to cope. Agnes thought it was incredible that the courier, under whose leadership they cleared the rift that even adventurers avoided, was unbelievable. Walking to his door, the girl thought that this was why Nashi deserved more respect for himself. The determination to rush to a place where one could die in order to prevent the rift was admirable. The girl entered the room and found Nagi still in bed. Upon seeing her, Nagi immediately thanked the girl for saving his squad. Agnes came closer and examined the young man, asking if he was really okay. And in response, Nagi assured that thanks to her, everything was fine. The girl threw her hand forward and, unable to contain her emotions, warned that she would say it directly. She gave her full name and emphasized that she was the deputy head of Sunset Wind. She pointed her finger at Nagi and declared her order for the young man to become her party member. It seemed like the best offer a regular courier could get, but Nagi smiled and gave a short no. The Sunset Wind Guild was located in the western city and was once considered one of the most famous and respected guilds. However, after the disappearance of the head, everything changed. The guild began to rapidly decline. In such an environment, a meeting was finally held in the guild after a long time. The girl spoke out against one of the proposals put forward. She believed that no matter how hard times were for their guild, they couldn't accept just anyone. Her name was Anne Dorothy. She was a gold-ranked summoner and the guild treasurer. Find me. Everyone's opinion should have been taken into account and everyone had the right to speak out. Nines, a gold-ranked knight and member of the Sunset Wind Guild, agreed and noted that Agnes's decision was too arbitrary. He added that they also said that the candidate was just a courier posing as an adventurer, and couriers and a swindler in one person was too much. Pharaoh, a copper-ranked priest and mercenary sent by the White Order, was outraged, believing that the others were too strict with him and voted in favor, since they already had very few participants. Anne Dorothy did not expect Pharaoh to agree and cried out in surprise. And at night she was able to joke that the courier apparently had a nice face, so the priest agreed to accept him. Pharaoh quickly lost her temper, not prepared for what her partner was allowing herself to do. She began to explain that she had only taken on his treatment, although she thought that with his hair down, he really looked very good. Stoneman, a copper-ranked defender and members of the Sunset Wind Guild, tried to interrupt the girls and asked them not to argue, emphasizing that arguing was useless because Agnes had already made her decision. Anne Dorothy became increasingly angry and attacked him for such an answer, rudely asking which side he decided to take. Pharaoh looked at Anne and threatened that in the future she might not give treatment to anyone. Stoneman hesitated, not wanting to rejoice in such conflicts, and he also couldn't make a decision so quickly. At that moment, unexpectedly for everyone, the door slammed and Agnes entered the room saying that there was no need to think anymore. The girl looked disappointed and explained that the courier refused her offer. The guild members literally froze in their seats because such an outcome of events was not expected in any way. All of them, regardless of their opinion, were shocked and immediately pounced on Agnes with questions about why this happened. The one who grimaced the most was Anne Dorothy, who just a minute ago was shouting the loudest that the courier was not worthy of their guild. Meanwhile, the courier was already packing his things and getting ready to set off. Mrs. Petra stood next to him. Nagi wrapped his hand with a bandage that came straight from his bag, which no longer surprised the inspector. After bandaging the wounds on his arms, Nagi began to gather his hair into a bun. He never wore his hair loose, always picking it up and pinning it back. All his preparations were accompanied by complete silence, and finally he smiled broadly and noted that he had finished. The inspector was a little worried that he was about to leave and tried to convince him to stay a little longer. Nagi did not give in and tried to convince her that everything was fine with him, except that he was attacked by anxiety when he sat for a long time without doing anything. The inspector finally agreed, but she couldn't contain her curiosity and wondered why Nagi had decided to refuse to join the Sunset Wind Guild, since such membership again carried many advantages. Smiling, Nagi noted that he understood that the guild provided many advantages, but on the other hand, the difficult relationships with people brought more troubles. Nagi liked to remain as he was at that moment, and he absolutely did not want to get involved in any such complications. Mrs. Petra decided not to argue with him, supporting his decision purely out of respect for him and his choice. But still, she later added that after 2 clashes with the guild, Dawn could have been safer under the protection of the guild, and such a strong one at that. Nagi asked the girl not to worry. Let's note that he had already come out of the water slightly wet twice, and the third time he was sure that he would be spared. Besides, he didn't see the point in them worrying about some courier like him. Mrs. Petra will do it and said that it was time for her to return to her guild. Nagi thanked her for everything and smiled broadly. The girl ran out of the hut, thanked the courier in return and asked him to turn to her for help if needed. Nagi was embarrassed at first, but only because he still didn't believe that people treated him well and didn't look down on him. But then very quickly, he laughed with joy. When he was left alone, he finally decided to check the reward. Whatever it was, he wanted it to be some expensive item. He looked into his bag and called Gluttony. The little animal still didn't respond, and Nagi climbed inside to look for it. Half submerged, Nagi began to look around, trying to find his friend. And finally he noticed him and was very happy to see him. Gluttony was standing in a very strange outfit and did not move from his place. Nagi, however, was not surprised by his clothes and then asked why Gluttony did not come out to his call and also clarified that he was wearing a shell. Guttural stood near the chest with the dungeon reward and looked very secretive. He indicated that all this meant absolutely nothing, but it was noticeable that he was hiding something. There was some strange sound coming from the chest, but Gluttony tried to pretend that he didn't hear anything, and when Nagi asked if he had checked the chest, he replied that he hadn't found anything there. Nagi. He was not surprised by such a statement and noted that it was too strange, but Gluttony behaved even more terribly, barely containing his excitement and trying in every way to take attention away from the chest. Nagi chuckled thoughtfully, trying to understand who his friend meant, who always tidied up his bag and looked into any place, knowing where everything was. Nagi asked him to step aside, deciding that he would see what exactly was in the chest himself, but the little animal screamed that this was not worth doing. But Nani no longer listened to him and began to open the latches of the chest. The courier was too curious about what was inside and what he paid for by spending so much effort. Well, when he lifted the lid of the chest, his face was distorted with shock and bewilderment. Inside were 3 small creatures, and the first thing Nagi asked was who these animals were. He assumed that these could be puppies, that is, monster cubs, but the question immediately arose as to why they ended up in this chest. Nagi turned to Gluttony and began to ask him what all this meant and where the reward from the dungeon had gone. Gluttony began to fuss and promised that he would definitely explain everything, although tears were welling up in his eyes. He said that as usual he dealt with the loot and subsequently opened the chest to tidy it up. Well, in the chest I found a lot of stones that looked like eggs, and right before his eyes these eggs began to crack, and these little animals appeared from them. Very suddenly and unexpectedly for him, all the babies hatched from the eggs right before his eyes. Well, let's not be hard to guess that Gluttony immediately became attached to them, because the cubs most likely mistook him for their mother. Nagi thought that if that was the case, then perhaps there were monster eggs in the chest, but they were not useless. Nagi knew that sometimes beast tamers took them away, but in his case the creatures had already hatched. Besides, these cubs looked like the trainers wouldn't want to take them in. It was a shame for Nagi, because he spent a lot of things in this dungeon, hoping to compensate for it with a reward. He couldn't imagine what to do with these little animals. Gluttony interrupted his thoughts, noting that apparently their parents were enslaved by the lindworm and lived in the Sky Citadel as slaves, and in order to save their children, the parents hid them in the stones. Nagi believed this version, and Gluttony began to ask him to leave them all, promising to look after them. After thinking for a bit, Nagi assumed that they could really leave them, because it didn't seem so bad, and he hoped that nothing terrible would happen to the 3 little creatures. Gluttony was happy and almost danced with joy. Nagi asked him to raise them and warned that if they made a mess in the bag, he would immediately throw them out. Gluttony immediately ran to the chest and said that they could stay. But when Nagi looked into the chest again, he discovered a whole huge army of small monsters who were looking straight at him with their bright eyes. The courier became noticeably nervous and confused at this sight. He immediately started shouting, asking why he saw what he saw. He climbed out of the bag in complete shock, and loud barking was coming from inside. He was really amused by this whole situation, and he couldn't even imagine what he would do with all this next. He was very sorry that the reward for breaking the dungeon turned out to be useless. But he was still lucky because he still had the reward for the cave dungeon. He decided to start with her and went further into the city. First of all, Nagi went to the trophy exchange point. From the paw came the merchant, who invited him to his place, noting that he was selling magic stones and monster trophies. Nagi quickly threw a bag of gold onto the table. He noted that he had not held so much gold in his hands for a very long time, and decided that he would first buy all the essentials that had run out. He asked for smokescreen mushrooms and explosive mushrooms, which he could not afford before due to the cost. There he replenished his food supplies, which had become significantly depleted. There, his plans included fixing his weapon and buying more arrows. After purchasing everything he needed, He asked the merchant to give some of the money to the adventurers named Ban and Nero. Despite this, he still had some left in his wallet. He bought himself some ice cream and happily walked down the street enjoying its taste. He decided to spend the rest of the money on a gastronomic tour, and this idea seemed very good to him. Nagi ran down the street, jumping from the happiness that overwhelmed him. But he didn't know that he was being watched from the balcony of one of the buildings. One young man quickly realized who exactly was running down the street before his eyes. He knew that this was the same guy who decided to speak out against the Dawn Guild, and this amused him a little. When he first heard it, he didn't believe it, but it turned out that it really was Porcelain Grade. The guy was angry that this bastard threw the petty thieves behind bars. Well, not only that, they said that he also managed to pull off a trick against Dullahan. He turned to his shadow, which was clearly a separate entity named Zero, and asked if the guy looked strong. She replied that if this happened twice, it was not a coincidence and even porcelain should be avoided. Nade, this guy agreed with him and noted that therefore he was really looking forward to the meeting. He could not have imagined that he would be sent against porcelain, but apparently he did not fully understand the seriousness of it. But he still expected that the courier would be able to show him something interesting. This made his eyes sparkle with enthusiasm and a wide smile appeared on his face. He couldn't lose sight of Nagi, so as soon as he disappeared around the bend, Need rose to jump off and hurry after him. If someone were watching him from the side, they would think that he simply disappeared, dissolving into thin air. Meanwhile, Nagi walked carefree and enjoyed delicious ice cream, unaware of any dangers. And Need was getting closer to him with every second. Nagi, even when he was already very close, still did not notice him and was thinking about his own. But suddenly, Nagi noticed that something incomprehensible was rushing towards him. And if he had taken another step, it would have been the end for him. But as it was, only his ice cream stick suffered, being cut in half. The ice cream remained in his mouth, and the stick began to fall to the ground. Need missed, and before he could stop in time, he fell forward a little when Nagi had already understood everything and was about to defend himself. He spat out his ice cream and started shouting at Naidu's back, trying to find out who he was and what he was doing. Need hissed, surprised that the boy was able to sense his bloodlust and stop. It was very curious that a porcelain-ranked courier was able to react so quickly to an unexpected attack. Need smiled broadly and twirled his dagger in his hand, noting that he was very interested in such an unusual courier. Nagi still didn't understand anything and didn't move from his place, listening to the stranger leave, hoping that it wouldn't all end so easily. Nagi supported his smile and shouted, asking what he was muttering under his breath. But Need suddenly rushed at him again with a dagger. Nagi was able to jump aside again, not allowing the stranger to cut off even a thread sticking out of his clothes. Need continued to attack him, asking him to show the courier that he had used the guilds against him, having only a porcelain rank. Nagi laughed loudly and prepared for another fight. Of course, he was interested in who this guy was who attacked him, but first of all, he needed to achieve a resolution to this situation. Why was it possible to see that Need wore a badge on his chest, which indicated that he was a gold-ranked mage? His movements were quite unusual. These movements were the style of a true killer. Nagi emphasized to himself that this guy was very openly demonstrating his hostility, and there was an assumption that the situation would not be resolved by a normal conversation. He understood that he couldn't just sit back and put his hand back and pulled out a sword from his bag. This gesture only added excitement to Need, who was so eager for the courier to show off some of his skills. He shouted at him that he was going to see what the swordsman who had bullied Jeff was capable of. Well, when Need noticed the mushroom strung on the tip of the courier's sword, he might have even been a little confused. It was a set of special courier tools, namely modified explosive mushrooms. Their main ability was to create a powerful explosion that could either kill an opponent or simply disorient them. Nagi was also amused by the current situation and noted to himself that fighting the adventurers openly was madness. When the mushrooms exploded, he decided to try to escape. I understand that their forces were unequal. Nagi ran towards the busy street and started screaming that he was dying. He ran out of the alley and loudly asked for help, attracting the attention of passers-by. He began to call the guards, shouting that they wanted to rob and kill him, and asked them to quickly come to his aid. The guards stood in place, not immediately understanding what was happening and where he should run. Nagi pointed to the alley he had come from and explained that there was an adventurer there who was actually a bandit trying to kill him. The guard, seeing the adventurer, recognized him and decided to check if he was mistaken. He asked if he was an adventurer from the Dawn Guild named Need. The boy, walking out onto the road, ignored the guard and was indignant that Nagi decided to run away rather than accept a fight. When Nagi heard who attacked him, he immediately understood what Mrs. Petra had told him earlier. But it was still strange that Need had carried out this attack in the center of the city. Nagi simply waited to see what would happen next. The guard politely apologized and demanded to know what was happening. Nade was not worried at all, and even acted a little too confidently than was necessary in his situation. Nade smiled and explained that he was simply using an unusual form of parenting. It all happened very quickly. Nade rushed forward and, pushing off the wall, jumped towards the courier. A dagger was visible in his left hand. Nagi did not have time to react to another attack, at least because he did not expect that Nade would be smart enough to do it in public and in front of the guards. Nade didn't use the dagger, but he stabbed Nagi in the chest very hard. The blow was very strong, and the young man, unable to stay on his feet, fell backwards. Nade turned to the guards and explained that the boy had added poison to their adventurer's food and disrupted the cleanup, thus daring to harm the entire Dawn Guild. He went on to emphasize that he was left without payment and that everyone should have known what happened to those who harmed his guild. Nagi did not want to be accused of being a vile adventurer of the dawn and shouted that it was all a lie. Nagi screamed that his guild member was trying to kill him and any actions he took were just self-defense. He looked around and asked them to trust him. But seeing the faces of the guards and the people passing by, I realized that it was useless. Everything was as Mrs. Petra said. The Dawn Guild had enormous influence. It was clear that in such a situation no one would take the side of Porcelain because defending it was simply unprofitable and could even cause harm. People started buzzing around. They confirmed that they had heard something similar and it was no longer news to them. People began to say that Porcelain really did cheat sometimes, and that recently couriers had begun to think themselves more important than adventurers. The guard, having heard this, turned to Need and noted that since everything was so, he would leave the solution to this situation to his discretion. Need thanked the guard with a smile and turned to Nami and asked if he understood the whole situation and that he had no allies there. Nagi hissed back that if people knew the truth, they would understand that the Dawn Guild was to blame and not him as a simple courier. He didn't understand why this revenge was necessary if everything was already over. Need leaned towards Nagi and noted that he was right, and it was not his fault. Even if it was one of the lower members, such things did not mean anything. But there was one important nuance in that Nagi had caused damage to their guild. Need repeated that the Dawn Guild had not sold anything to their offenders, and they must make it clear to everyone that they are not to be trifled with. Need said loudly that whoever decided to go against the Dawn Guild always received a counterattack, and Nagi should become a kind of reminder so that everyone would see and remember this fact. Need, looking at how Nagi was barely holding back his emotions, asked him not to worry and promised that he would leave him alive. He wore the insignia of the men he had killed, but he believed that the porcelain rank was not worth such an honor. Need smiled and emphasized that from that day on, every time they looked at the scars on Naga's face, people would remember the Dawn Guild. He wanted to leave a mark on him and rushed at him. He used his special assassin skill and jumped on the courier with daggers. It was a 90 degrees cut, and Nagi again had no time to jump away. The mark of an adventurer from the Dawn Guild would soon appear on his face, and every adventurer from there would become his enemy. The couriers could not have allies, since everyone thought about himself. But that time Nagi's luck turned and everything was different. Agnes Farid jumped out right in front of him and protected him from injury and a shameful mark for the rest of his life. She turned to Need and asked him in a commanding tone to put away his sword. She explained that Nagi was now a member of her guild, Sunset Wind. The girl warned that from that moment on, any attack on Nagi would be considered an attack on their guild and would not go unpunished. After that situation on the street, Need gave in and simply walked away. His shadow always followed him. Zero asked Need if he was sure it was okay to just leave. He noted that the guild had expected more. Need himself was unhappy with the outcome, but he had no choice since he had not planned to fight Agnes. He thought out loud that even if he had decided to fight her, nothing terrible would have happened. But unfortunately for him, she was already busy with someone else. Need scrolled through his fingers and continued to think about what had happened. In the end, he just wasted his energy, even though it seemed to him that the courier would turn out to be someone truly significant. Despite the fact that the young man was quite skilled for a courier, a porter was still a porter. Need considered him an unremarkable weakling, not worth wasting time and energy on. Need believed that even though it all ended ingloriously, after that the courier was most likely scared to death and couldn't do anything more. Zero liked this conclusion very much, but he doubted that it could really be so. Nade smiled and suddenly felt that there was something wrong with his cheek. There was a cut on his cheek from which blood spurted out when he attacked his face. This surprised him very much, because he could not notice when this wound appeared and did not know who exactly did it. Zero rose from the shadows and was slightly outraged that Need hadn't even had time to understand how this had been done to him. He ordered him to slowly remember everything step by step. It looked like an evil shadow was hypnotizing the adventurer, forcing him to do whatever he wanted. He ordered Need to remember everything, with an incredibly evil smile on his face. Need succumbed to the spell of his shadow and dove into his consciousness to search for that needed memory. Need was transported back to the moment when he was still on the roof of the building and noticed the courier running along the road. The shadow plunged him into the very first moment when Need met Nagi. He remembered how he missed because the courier managed to sense his approach and prevent the blow. He saw the boy's laughing face before his eyes. Everything down to the smallest detail was running through his head. Need saw himself turning around and facing Nagi again. At that moment, the courier took a sword out of his bag. The shadow asked to remember everything up until the very moment when Need tried to finish off the courier. The final attack, full of confidence, was supposed to achieve its goal. By then, the courier had given up all attempts and resigned himself to his fate, simply waiting for the blow. Nagi looked at Need with reverence, whose special ability was about to hit him in the face. There were only a few seconds left, but there was one important but in that situation. Nagi didn't really give up, but waited patiently for his chance. His fingers were clenched into fists and waiting. Having determined the right moment, the fingers unclenched and the small knife descended down the wrist. Nagi skillfully intercepted it in such a way that he could defend himself. Zero emphasized that even in that situation, the courier used the fact that Need's gaze was directed upward and that it was a long time ago an opportunity to pull the dagger out of his sleeve. In that situation, Nagi didn't have many options on what to do, but he still had a chance to defend himself. In his world, no one ever took the courier's side, so Nagi was obliged to protect himself. His eyes sparkled with anger and deep-hardened resentment, but there was also the courage that was necessary when you had a porcelain rank. Need was so carried away by the feeling of his power and imminent victory that he did not notice how Nagi sharply threw a dagger in his direction. He passed by the adventurer's skill without revealing himself. The dagger and Need were moving towards each other at high speed, so when the blade flew past and only grazed the adventurer's cheek, he was unable to feel it. Zero noted that he had told Need the same thing many times. He warned that once Need decided he had won, he would become distracted and vulnerable. After listening to this and trying to recreate everything that had happened, the adventurer cursed, realizing that he'd indeed missed a blow. He wiped the blood from his cheek and licked his fingers. Now he was even more curious. He smiled and noted that in that case, he would probably take back his words about the courier's worthlessness. He began to laugh loudly, and his laughter was picked up by the shadow. After listening to Zero, Nade decided not to leave the situation as it was and to deal with the guy, as he had planned earlier. Nagi tidied himself up, and the final touch was to hide the dagger back in his sleeve. He carried it, just in case he couldn't get the weapon out of his bag. But of course, he knew that this knife wasn't enough against an adventurer, especially one of high rank. He looked at Agnes and mentally thanked her, because if she had not appeared out of nowhere and helped him, it would have become dangerous. Nagi was now interested in who Need was and what could be expected from him. He couldn't believe that the Dawn Guild would actually send out an adventurer of that caliber just for revenge. The courier no longer wanted to have anything to do with him or this guild, but simply wanted to return to his normal life. A hand fell on our shoulder, and a man's voice mockingly asked what the young man was thinking about so hard. Stoneman and Nines walked behind him and laughed when Nagi flinched in fear at the surprise. Stoneman guessed that Nagi still couldn't get what had happened in the square out of his head. The adventurers noted that Need was a known scoundrel, even among his fellow Dawn guildmates. Since he controlled the slum bandits, even the guards preferred not to touch him. Nagi laughed. He had heard something about the Dawns, but he didn't know they were so cold-blooded. What surprised him most was that even if he had made enemies, attacking them in the middle of the city was strange. Agnes emphasized these words and stated that this was precisely why it was unsafe to stay in the city, and therefore she decided that it would be safer to go underground. Agnes recalled her words and asked why Nagi didn't join them while they were cleaning up. Nagi was only too happy with the offer, as he would simply continue his work. Nagi then shared that the place they were passing was too chilly. The cold crept under their clothes and invited a feeling of dampness. They reached the cemetery dungeon, and it was the first time Nagi saw a dungeon of this class with such a high rank. The graveyard dungeon was a B-rank dungeon and probably held a lot of challenges but also good rewards. Nines laughed loudly at how scared the courier was. He noted that for his guild, such a dungeon was a piece of cake, and the courier did not have to worry about his safety. He asked Nagi to simply rely on him, collect trophies, and most importantly, not to lag behind their group, and Stoneman offered to hide behind his back if it suddenly became dangerous. Nagi thought that Nines was not quite right. Even though it was a V-class, they had one gold and one copper adventurer. But the most important thing was that Agnes Farid wore a mithril rank badge, so thanks to her, the overall strength of the guild increased significantly. With such an uber comrade, their forces were already more than necessary. But still, Nagi was a little worried about something. Usually in B-class and higher dungeons, it was important to balance the group composition or select it for the dungeon itself. In the Sunset Wind Guild, everyone belonged to the combat class. Among them were a battle mage, a knight, and a shield bearer. Nagi thought that given the nature of this dungeon, it would be a good idea to have a priest with them. If everyone was focused on one type of combat, it would be harder to deal with unexpected situations. Agnes's voice interrupted Naga's thoughts. The girl asked him to stop and concentrate. She pointed in one direction and noted that apparently they were about to be met with less than warm greetings. A squad of zombies appeared ahead, advancing on the squad of adventurers. The zombies looked unfriendly, to put it mildly. Their growling and stench could be heard from afar and very clearly. Agnes Farid prepared to attack, drawing her magic sword. The girl was not one to think too much and immediately rushed into the attack. She did not need to give any commands to the others because everyone already knew what to do. She just shouted that she was going to clear the way and jumped into the zombie army. With seemingly light swings of her sword, Agnes chopped up zombies like cucumbers for a salad. Her sword glowed and further set her enemies on fire, dealing additional damage. The girl acted very confidently, and without unnecessary movements and efforts, successfully advanced deeper into the zombie army. Seeing how Agnes Farid carried herself on the battlefield, one could tell without a doubt what rank badge she wore on her chest. She killed zombies several at a time, and with just one swing of her sword, she was like lightning. But she moved very quickly from one point of the field to another, and enemies under her weapon were literally incinerated in a matter of seconds. The rest of the adventurers were not visible on the battlefield, and apparently this was a preliminary agreement. Given Agnes's excellent fighting skills, the others could simply be in her way. She had no problem depriving her enemies of heads and limbs. Fighting an entire army of undead on her own was no big deal for her. A huge monster appeared in the distance among the high flames. It was also one of the zombies, but it was much larger. His gaze was fixed only on her. His one eye was shining with the desire to take someone's life. And when it was the life of such a beautiful adventurer, the monster rushed towards her without hesitation. The monster was several times taller and larger than normal human height. It screamed loudly and waved its arms, but Agnes stood bravely before it and waited for the right moment to attack. Watching such a fierce battle, Nagi noted that, as expected for the B rank, medium mobs were coming from the very beginning. Nines watched the battle with admiration and did not doubt his commander in the least. Despite the monster's enormous strength, Agnes had no doubts about her imminent victory. The girl circled around him, trying to find his weak spot and end this battle as quickly as possible. The monster was also confident in his own strength and went straight towards her. Agnes was not only strong due to her skills, but also had incredible agility and cunning in combat. The monster didn't have time to notice how the girl disappeared right in front of him and suddenly appeared behind him, attacking with a jump. She used her special skill as a battle mage. It was combustion, which she could use to cause great damage to any enemy. It was difficult for a simple observer to follow her movements. The hulking zombie giant had very little chance of escaping her hands alive, not having the strength to keep an eye on her. The first blow landed on his neck. It was immediately followed by a harsh blow to the back. It took Agnes a few seconds to deliver at least 10 blows to the monster. The zombie roared loudly. His body was on fire and falling apart from the cuts. But Agnes did not back down. For her, this was not a reason to end the fight and leave. Next, she used the special skill of the battle mage, Bud. It was a small sphere of fire that really did look like a flower bud. This bud grew at a rapid speed, increasing in size and becoming hotter and hotter. When the bud reached its full opening, a powerful explosion occurred, which wiped off the face of the earth all living things in the place of its action. Now this fight was over for Agnes, and she felt the taste of her victory. Meanwhile, Nagi and the rest of the adventurers simply stood to the side and watched what kind of things their commander could do. This spectacle was like a real movie. It was incredibly interesting to watch. Nagi was simply delighted with the skills of the mithril rank and noted that it was unnecessary to worry about the composition of the group. Nagi had seen many adventurers, but this was the first time he had seen such a powerful talent. Talent was the foundation for any adventurer. Each adventurer had a talent that allowed them to unleash their unique power corresponding to their class, and the abilities depended on the talent of each individual. That was why adventurers were able to fight monsters that were stronger than them, and if it was a mithril adventurer, then his level of talent was beyond reasonable comprehension. Agnes glanced towards her naked faces and noted that there was no time to hesitate. Before these creatures resurrected, I had to move on. The group, not daring to object, immediately rushed forward after their commander. Resurrection was the main feature that distinguished the frenzied dungeon code from the usual ones. The monsters in these dungeons are generally lower level than those in others. But the difficulty here was different. The killed monsters rose from the dead again and again. The monsters that had already been destroyed remained dead for a very short time. And after some time, they returned to life and were ready to fight as if nothing had happened. These monsters were capable of endlessly reviving and pursuing those who attacked them. If you moved too slowly, zombies could surround you from two sides, and then the probability of successfully completing the dungeon would decrease sharply. Therefore, in such cases, it is important to either take with you a priest who is able to perform an exorcism or to use holy water sold in the church. But the problem was that both were very expensive. The adventurers had not yet moved too far when the first zombies began to open their eyes. Agnes cursed and discovered that the dead had already begun to revive and were following them again. Nine stood up to lament what he had said before going into the dungeon, that it was worth taking Ferroro with him. When Nagi asked who it was, Nines explained that she had a priest in her guild who was always hanging around their base as if it was her own home. He called her a real devil in the guise of a priest because every time she demanded a lot of gold. And before going to this dungeon, she again demanded a simply exorbitant amount to go with them. Nines despaired right before his eyes because their guild was so poor that they couldn't even afford Ferroro, and Stoneman added to this that she even treated very poorly. Agnes, hearing conversations behind her, turned around and noted that the complaints would come after the cleanup. The girl indicated that she would deal with the enemies ahead and asked Stone to detain those who were walking behind. Looking at Nines, Agnes thought for a moment, and then she asked him to at least just cheer for their entire team. Nagi approached him and asked if he was going to fight, which made him feel embarrassed. It was very difficult for him to admit the following. I forgot my weapon in the guild office, so now I had no opportunity to help in the fight. Nagi was very surprised by this. He did not understand how an adventurer could forget his weapon before clearing the dungeon, but Nines tried to justify himself by saying that everyone was in a hurry and the hustle and bustle did not benefit him. Agnes shouted that Nines always forgot something, and Stoneman added that the worst time was when he showed up for a cleanup without clothes. Nanetz was already very ashamed and he screamed, asking everyone to shut up. Nagi laughed slightly and noted that he just happened to have a spare weapon that he was happy to share. He rummaged through his bag and asked Nines what kind of sword he preferred. He assumed that since he was a knight, perhaps he used a long sword. This statement surprised Nanetz greatly. He had never expected the courier to carry so many different weapons. It was not clear what had upset him, but he rushed at Nagi, screaming loudly. He called him an idiot and hit him hard, knocking him to the ground. Nagi, not understanding what was happening, asked what he was allowing, rubbing his forehead. Nines pointed his finger at himself and declared that he would not fight. He shouted that he didn't use any other sword except Elizabeth Lovest. This was his knightly vow, which he had no right to break. Nagi sat on the ground rather confused and did not know what to answer. He couldn't understand how it was possible to leave this sword somewhere if there was no other way to use it. Stoneman's voice came from somewhere, looking confused. He noticed that the monsters that were chasing them were somehow strange. There were fewer of them than expected, and they also moved slower than they should have. Agnes looked at the group of zombies behind her and was shocked by what she found. The zombies' legs had many large thorns sticking out of them, which actually slowed them down. The girl couldn't even imagine where they could have come from. After all, in the area where they were located, it was impossible to run into such thorns. Nagi smiled and confirmed that these were indeed thorns. Note that the monster still resurrected over and over again. He continued and said that the main danger in this dungeon was to be surrounded by revived husks. Of course, you could just kill them, but it was more effective to slow down their movement. It was one of the courier's special toolkits, consisting of a trap made of thorns and glue balls. Nagi scattered them absolutely everywhere as they moved. Nagi, looking at the back of his head, admitted that these were simple things, so there was no point in expecting much from them. Agnes and Stoneman were amazed by such cunning, and their eyes showed gratitude and admiration. They unanimously noted that Nagi was apparently much more useful than Knight, which really infuriated him. Having figured out what was happening with the zombies and realizing that there was a little more time, the adventurers rushed forward. Zombies, of course, continued to respawn, and it was unclear how much more their numbers would increase. Along the way, Nines kept saying that if Elizabeth had been with them, their buttocks would not have been so wet, but Agnes shouted at him that it was not the time to complain. They needed to get out of there quickly before the zombies surrounded them. The end of the cave was already visible ahead. They still had just a little bit left to get out. As she approached the exit, Agnes shouted at Stoneman to do what he had to do. He used his special skill as a defender. Stoneman swung his right arm in a great way, readying it for a punch. Hitting the ground with all his might, he raised a stone shield that was supposed to prevent the zombie from moving forward. The zombies couldn't break it or climb over it, so the adventurers had a better chance of successfully completing the journey. Of course, over time, zombies could have gotten over this stone wall, but it would not have happened so quickly. Stoneman called out to Agnes, letting her know that everything was ready. But Stoneman immediately warned everyone that this stone wall would not last as long as they would like. He repeated Agnes's words that they should get out of the dungeon as soon as possible. When they left that level, they found themselves in the underground lake area of the cemetery dungeon. Nines was the most surprised of all because according to the plan, they were not supposed to end up here. Well, there was one good thing. There was a raft on the shore, which meant they wouldn't have to waste time crafting it. But he was still indignant that they would have to sail on this disgrace to continue the cleanup. Stoneman was still glad to have a not very good raft because they had to hurry. Nines noted that the fruit might not be able to withstand the weight of all their armor, especially the stone armor of the stone man. Agnes responded that they could take off their armor since they were not fighting. Nagi got involved in this conversation and noted that he was thinking the same thing and asked them to take off their armor. Nagi took his bag off his shoulders and opened it, offering to put the armor in it. Nines initially thought that they would have to abandon their armor right in this dungeon, but when he saw the bag, he immediately agreed. Without his armor, he felt less confident but continued to undress. Agnes's face began to twist violently as she watched this process. And at some point, the girl couldn't take it anymore and turned purple with anger. She screamed loudly, asking to what level they were going to undress when she saw Ninette's standing in his underwear. Well, he noted that they still needed to lose weight, so he decided to undress completely. Stoneman was in the same shock as Agnes and began to beg to erase his memory. The conversation should have stopped and they climbed onto the raft. They had to swim across the entire lake, which took some time, and the adventurers had the opportunity to rest a little. Nines got the most pleasure, even though he hadn't really tried hard before. He sprawled out on the raft and made no secret of the pleasure he was enjoying. Moreover, he also made fun of Agnes, who was clearly embarrassed by his appearance. Well, his jokes didn't last long because the girl couldn't take it anymore and punched him in the eye, which made him shut up very quickly. After receiving a black eye, Nines promised to always carry clothes with him from now on, but Agnes and her dad stupidly asked him to at least just take a weapon with him. Nines was indignant and said that with all the power of the oath, he could have passed through this dungeon alone, although his appearance at that moment said the exact opposite. At this point, Agnes couldn't take it anymore and started yelling at him that this was the problem. She didn't understand why he made a vow he couldn't keep. Nagi did not interfere in their conversation and simply watched, thinking about Ninette's nightly oath. It was said that adventurers with knightly talent took oaths expressing their faith. Such oaths imposed strict rules that had to be followed, but in exchange they gave enormous power. Mr. Nines swore that he would not fight with any weapon other than Elizabeth Lovest, which placed certain restrictions on him. Well, in return, his sword became a legendary weapon that could not be broken. The knight's oath was a true exchange, but a question arose. Nagi wondered if the oath was kept secret so that it would not become a weakness, which Agnes confirmed. But Nines told everyone, so that in their city absolutely everyone knew about his oath. Nines continued to insist that even if everyone knew about his oath, then with Elizabeth Lovest, he was invincible. Agnes yelled at him again that he was constantly forgetting this vaunted sword, and then noted that he was always a fool here, so there was no need to be surprised. Taking the opportunity, the girl noted that she had heard about Nagi's bag, and it was really impressive. The girl asked if the weight disappeared or completely if you put something inside. Nagi explained that the weight did not disappear completely. At the moment I placed the items in the bag, a powerful weight-reducing spell was cast on it, and even if you add the weight of 2 sets of armor, they will be lighter than a normal stone. Stoneman smiled and admired such a thing, and noted that it was incomparably more valuable than the Sword of Nines. Stoneman had his reasons for speaking out this way. After all, he had the opportunity to try a specially prepared turkey, which was simply magnificent, even though it was stored in a bag. He could not even imagine that he would eat such a dish in such a place and get so much pleasure. Nines completely agreed with him because he too was delighted with the fact that the bag preserved the food so well. But even here he couldn't hold back and joked that Agnes, even while fighting zombies, was busy eating buns. The girl was outraged by this and asked not to comment on such things and explained that she had not had time to eat normally before this. The two continued to argue. Agnes pointed out that Naines was idle while she hunted. He believed that he also suffered running in armor. Their argument was interrupted by Nagi, who asked them to pay a little attention forward, and noted that it looked like everything was about to start. Agnes was distracted from the argument and glanced in the direction Nagi asked. Their raft was surrounded on all sides by boats, which contained an impressive number of monsters. Even in the middle of the lake, there was a huge chance of encountering enemies, and it was necessary to engage in battle right on the water. Some of the monsters had bows, making them much more dangerous for Cancer to deal with. The boats were loaded to the brim with members of the dungeon army of adventurers. There was no way to even escape. Nagi noted that their fruit really turned out to be a real trap for adventurers. Agnes shared his opinion, stressing that it was not at all advantageous to fight on the raft. Ninth was the most indignant again. He shouted that everyone knew that the fruit was a trap, but they still sat on it. Agnes emphasized that there was no other way, because it was a dungeon and no one there would help the adventurers by providing them with a raft. Agnes understood the most basic problem, which was that even if they had expected a trap, there were too many enemies and at that moment only she could fight. Even if she started cleaning out their boats, their fruit would become a target for arrows first. The girl turned to her partners and asked them to leave this task to her. Nagi was already attaching his bag to the raft and said that it would be difficult to fight enemies on the water. Having finished tying the bag, he suggested breaking through them and trying to get to the shore as quickly as possible. Agnes looked at the bag in surprise and asked if Nagi wanted to say that he had a plan to break through with the help of his bag. He smiled broadly and confirmed this, but warned that it was worth holding on tighter. I observed the cheerful mood of the courier. We couldn't even imagine how he was going to do what he had planned. They all kept their eyes on him. It wasn't that they didn't trust him at all, but the uncertainty of the situation was still frightening. This was another secret skill of the courier: compressed air. The bag swelled to enormous proportions in seconds. Nagi climbed onto her and reached for the ties to loosen them. As soon as he did this, a powerful stream of air burst out of the bag, which caused their raft to jerk forward sharply. I really had to hold on very tightly, otherwise I could easily fly out of the raft into the water. Agnes was stunned by this sight and considered it to be some kind of air magic. Nagi laughed loudly, denying any magical influence, and explained that he was simply compressing and releasing a previously stored stream of air in the bag. He said that he once left his bag in a windy place and realized that it could catch the air currents. And then I discovered that if I just released everything at once, I could very quickly move some distance forward. The monsters from their boats began to aim their bows at the adventurers' raft. If it weren't for Nagi's successful invention, things would have been very bad for the adventurers. Nagi adjusted the movement of the raft in the direction needed by the group, and everything worked out as the courier had expected. They managed to break through the enemy boats and approach the shore. The monsters were also surprised by what they saw and lowered their weapons. Well, something unpleasant was waiting for the adventurers ahead. Nagi shouted and drew everyone else's attention forward. Their path was blocked by a wooden wall. The zombies managed to set up such an elaborate trap. Agnes immediately pulled herself together and shouted that she would try to break through this wall and clear the way. But Nagi asked the girl not to hurry and noted that they had already gained enough speed. Nagi smiled and explained that he would help Agnes because fire and wind went well together. Agnes prepared to use her flaming sword. Meanwhile, Nagi was trying to pick up the bag so that he could help Agnes and connect their elements. The air carried the flames around to a huge distance. Everything around was burning brightly. The balloon and the fire wave did their job. The wooden wall quickly burst into flames and was about to fall, along with the zombies standing on it in no time. It was a clear victory thanks to Nagi and his ability to invent. The wall began to crack, and a hole began to form in the middle of it. The wall could not hold out for even a minute and soon shattered into pieces, opening the way for the raft with the adventurers. They were very lucky that the barrier was made of wood, because if the zombies had managed to build a stone wall, it would have been difficult for the adventurers to get out of such a situation. The adventurers walked through the fallen gates incredibly proud of themselves. Agnes stood at the very front of the raft so that she could immediately rush into battle. The adventurers got out on dry land rather roughly. Their raft simply fell apart into logs. Everyone stood near the broken raft and understood that they miraculously managed to get out of the water. Agnes walked forward a little and shouted that apparently they had reached that very place. Apparently, the boss of this dungeon was there. In front of them was the Death Fortress area. The scale of the underground fortress in the crypt was very impressive. Agnes fearlessly moved towards the entrance. When they went inside, Nines asked if the others thought it was too difficult for a B rank. Stoneman agreed with him, as a normal squad would definitely not have been able to handle it. Nines started complaining that their guild always chose the most difficult dungeon and was indignant about why they couldn't choose something simpler with good rewards. Agnes reined him in. Let's remember that they existed to take such tasks. Stoneman agreed that it was too hard for a first dungeon. He suggested that Nagi might have been unaccustomed to it, but their guild preferred to clear dungeons that others avoided. Nagi responded that he didn't care where he went, since all the hardships fell on the adventurers. Agnes was cautious and warned the others that despite the B rank in the group, they couldn't let their guard down, and in such dungeons the boss always brought problems. Flying through the huge hall ahead, the adventurers discovered the throne on which the dungeon boss sat. His growl could be heard by everyone. He was indignant when he saw the adventurers. How could they dare to come to his fortress? He was not at all pleased with the invasion of his domains and called the adventurers fools. In front of them sat a boss monster called the Lich King. He looked very menacing, and it was immediately clear that it was not so easy to fight him. Nine said that he just couldn't believe that they had met the Lich King in the B-rank dungeon. Stoneman supported him, because it was the first time he had seen such a coincidence. The Lich was a boss from the magic category. Agnes knew better than anyone that magic was quite unpredictable. She had spent too much energy walking the entire way alone, which made the task much more difficult. Now they needed to quickly finish off the boss before anything could go wrong. Agnes immediately rushed into the attack without waiting for any kind of meeting with the others. The king still remained sitting on his throne, smiling slyly as Agnes ran towards him with her flaming sword. Most of the undead were dumb monsters that simply ran towards their target. However, with such monsters, everything was different. The Lich was different. His thirst for knowledge remained with him even after his death. He quickly began to understand the meaning of Agnes's actions. He quickly realized that her desperate rush was to protect the allies behind her. And only after realizing this did he decide to get ahead of the girl. He found a solution. When Agnes was already very close to the throne and was carrying out her attack, the Lich disappeared right under her nose. The girl could not have predicted this. She was shocked by such a trick of the monster. The Lich King was a powerful mage and could use a skill that could transport him through space. He used a magical jump and found himself at the other end of the hall, dodging the attack. He found himself right next to the rest of the adventurers. He hissed again that the adventurers were fools and, using some kind of magic spell, ordered them to become his servants. This magic was directed at Nagi, who was unable to run away. Agnes screamed at Nagi, trying to bring him back to reality and make him dodge the king's magic. She became his savior again, appearing right in front of him and shielding him from the magical influence. Everything was happening too fast. Nagi looked up. He saw Agnes desperately rushing to fight the Lich, protecting the others. The king's magic spread throughout the hall, creating the effect of some kind of portal, from which it was unlikely that one could escape. Nagi had time to think that they were probably all lucky enough to encounter the worst situation in this dungeon. Agnes, defending her guildmates and Naga, fell herself. Now she was their enemy. The Lich King could now attack her with his hands and use her power. It was hard to imagine how one could fight the dungeon boss himself. But when Agnes, the only high-ranking adventurer who could handle the entire dungeon on her own, appeared on his side, the situation worsened completely. Nine screamed and ordered Stoneman to take Nagi out of the castle and escape from the dungeon. Stone was indignant and began to ask what he was going to do, because he still couldn't stop Agnes on his own. Stoneman asked us all to run together and not to be stupid. Nines's voice changed, noting that he did not understand what his partner was talking about. He was a knight and could not afford to simply escape from the dungeon. He never turned his back on the enemy. A noble knight who never turned his back on the enemy. That's how Nines considered himself. It may have sounded vain, but he felt really cool. He explained to Stoneman that even if the enemy was Agnes, she had already spent a lot of energy, and her famous flame was also gradually fading. He reminded that the girl had cleared the dungeons almost single-handedly, and he could have easily dealt with her on his own, and perhaps this was part of his plan. In Agnes's current state, he could handle her even with his bare hands. At least he thought so. The girl was ready to pounce on him, completely forgetting who this guy really was and who she was. Her mind was controlled by the Lich King, and at that moment she only knew that she had to protect her king. Even such a close person as Nines turned out to be her most sworn enemy, and she did not remember him at all in her life. Nines gathered all his strength, which he had been saving up all along the way. Now his idleness could help the whole group. Everything had to be done carefully in order to be able to get Agnes back. But the girl only wanted his death and rushed to attack, using her magical abilities and a flaming sword. Nines was thrown back by the powerful wave of heat that emanated from the girl. And he, who was holding on, cursed because Agnes had much more strength than he had assumed. The girl caught up with him very quickly. The blow from her flaming sword was very hot, and even being close to him took his breath away. This blow was miraculously survived by Nanette's. He folded in half and coughed loudly. Agnes was unstoppable. The girl regrouped and rushed towards him with the next attack. Nines froze for a moment, seeing that he would have to feel her flaming blade on himself again. He shouted to himself that a knight does not turn his back on the enemy. He understood that he could not stand against her and tried to force himself to stay where he was. But he still couldn't restrain himself and suddenly jumped to the side. He used his special skill and began to bounce backwards towards the exit of the fortress. Nagi and Stoneman were near the outer gate. They hadn't managed to run too far yet. But they didn't hurry as much as they could. The sounds coming from inside the castle were terrible. But suddenly they heard Ninette's, who begged them to wait for him too. He ran even faster than they did from the castle. Stoneman was very surprised and noted that Nines promised to fight Agnes, but the adventurer called him a blockhead and asked how he thought he should do it. Stoneman didn't even hope. Nines had turned his back so many times even to the undead. Nines was not pleased with such words and began to say that if he had his sword with him, everything would have been different. Nagi interrupted their argument. You asked to look down from the cliff. Something was happening on the shore of the lake. A lot of boats approached the shore, cutting through the waves. It looked like all the undead that were in the dungeon had landed near them. The adventurers were completely surrounded and had no chance to escape. There was a huge army of zombies on the shore that would not let them go back. Stoneman cried out, noting that there was no end to the undead. Nagi said that there were undead below, and behind them was Agnes under the influence of the Lich King. When he saw her at the gates of the fortress, he immediately called her by name, attracting her attention. Stoneman realized that it would be better not to let the courier interfere with the plan, and offered to detain everyone he could. He slammed his powerful fist into the ground, causing stone walls to form, and then the rocks started creeping up. They formed a kind of fence that was supposed to prevent Agnes and the zombies from passing. Agnes didn't look at all lost in the middle of this concrete jungle. She was very focused, and this unpleasantness didn't even anger her. She quickly looked around, her enchanted eyes sparkling. And in a second, she was no longer in her former place. Her jumps were very high and long, so I had no trouble clearing the stone walls of Stoneman. She got out of the trap very quickly, although the adventurers did not hope that it would work for long. Stoneman was, of course, a little upset, because he had put a lot of effort into creating these walls. The adventurers had to come up with something quickly to delay Agnes at least a little. Nagi began to think about how to act in this situation so as not to harm anyone, but also to do something truly effective. He tried to think of something that could stop Madame Agnes for even a moment. He understood that half measures could not work here, so there was only one option left. He decided to play his trump card and threw something in her direction. Agnes immediately noticed this and followed the trajectory of the thing's flight, trying to understand what exactly it was. And very abruptly, she jumped up and started running after the thing that Nagi had thrown. Nagi used a bait trap, and to everyone's happiness, it worked. It was a small cake with berry filling that the girl couldn't resist. She jumped after him straight from the cliff without a second thought, and in the end, she managed to catch it right in flight with her mouth. Having landed, the girl immediately began to eat it with great pleasure, seemingly forgetting about everything in the world. Nagi laughed and wiped the sweat from his forehead, admitting that he wasn't sure what he did. Even under Agnes's control, he mostly followed his instincts. But the courier managed to buy only a little time, and their group could not relax. They ran back inside the castle, thinking that it wouldn't hurt to find shelter. They ran so fast that their breath became labored, and it took a little time to recover. After listening, the adventurers realized that apparently no one was chasing them, and they had little time to figure out what to do. The undead were already climbing the cliff and would soon reach the castle. The zombies outside were about to join the others in the castle. It was clear that the upcoming battle would not be easy for the adventurers, and they began to think about a plan. Nanes noted that it looked like Agnes was receiving buffs from the Lich. Her mana should have been nearly depleted after clearing the dungeon alone, but perhaps the boss's strength had reignited her flames. And as always in his repertoire, Nines began to try to rise in the eyes of others and emphasized that otherwise he would have definitely dealt with her. Looking around, he asked the others where they were, but no one knew. Judging by the amount of weapons around, this room was some kind of arsenal. Nagi thought for a moment and noted that the equipment didn't look like the kind the undead would use. Nagi assumed that this could be a trophy warehouse and decided to take a closer look. Nines and Stoneman's eyes widened when they heard that they were talking about trophies. Nagi explained that the monster with intelligence, like the beam, sometimes collected the items of the adventurers they killed to show off their power, and apparently it was the same thing. Nagi thought to himself that this dungeon was more difficult than his rank suggested. And since his boss was the Lich, it was no surprise that many fish fell through here. But something was bothering Nagi. The room also contained children's toys and items that clearly did not belong to the adventurers. Stoneman shared that he knew of a story. He recalled that their guild specialized in clearing dungeons that others avoided. This dungeon was cursed due to frequent unsuccessful raids after its appearance. But after this, cases of people going missing in the Godfather villages became more frequent. Stoneman emphasized that they did not notice anything suspicious during the cleanup and hesitated slightly. Nagi answered for him that it was like being kidnapped by the dungeon itself. The monsters were coming out of the dungeon, and after they got out, they went hunting for people. It sounded very strange, but it could well be true. Naines didn't like this suggestion at all, and he clenched his teeth in anger in order to somehow control himself. He objected that there was no rift in the dungeon, and the monsters could not possibly exist only inside it. Nagi emphasized that this was just a theory, and such phenomena occurred very rarely. As a rule, monsters did not go beyond the dungeon. Without replenishing its energy, they did not weaken much from the outside. Monsters could only leave the dungeon if it was broken or if it was a so-called outer dungeon, so the only way to test the theory was to kill the Lich. Nines began to hiss that he would grind that creature into dust. This knight cannot turn a blind eye to injustice. Nagi and Stoneman looked at him suspiciously, but when he asked what was wrong, they did not admit it. Nines took out a handkerchief and confidently said that this time everything would be different. He began to blindfold himself with this handkerchief, but did not immediately tell what he was going to do. Having made up his mind, he declared that he would break his knightly oath and take up the sword. Nagi reminded that if a knight broke an oath, he would face severe punishment, and asked again whether Naines was ready for this and suggested that perhaps the oath could be somehow circumvented. Naines didn't know this because in essence the knight's oath was essentially a contract with oneself. But if one manages to deceive oneself, everything will be all right, but only theoretically. He never did this, but he hoped to win. Stoneman dropped everything else and asked how they were to get to the Lich, to which Nines pointed out that this was their task, and he would be deceiving himself. Nagi doubted that all this could work, and that the guys would be able to implement everything without harming themselves. The courier asked if it was certain that if Nines was delivered to the Lich, he would be able to defeat him, but he noted that this question made no sense. He pointed out that if his hypothesis was correct, it was no longer a question of whether they could. He emphasized that they had to do it and smiled broadly. Nagi agreed and offered to become his eyes in that case and lead him to the boss. Stoneman cried out, understanding how the guy was going to do this because new forces had already joined the army. To get rid of the guy's shoulders, you'll first have to fight Agnes. And after defeating her, you need to break through a huge army of zombies. Nagi took out a crossbow from his bag, preparing to break through. He understood what they needed to break through the enemy. He examined his crossbow, making sure it was in good working order, and noted that they needed their own army to break through. The Lich King sat on his throne, Agnes stood next to him, and an army of zombies gathered in the hall. The monsters growled and roared, expecting a possible battle to come soon. They were ready to defend their dungeon and their king. Several small zombies ran into the hall and, almost out of breath from running for so long, muttered something to the king. They reported that they had found the adventurers and the king appreciated this information. He narrowed his eyes and ordered his army to capture all the aliens and allowed them to cut off one or two of their limbs if they wanted. The zombies rushed to the exit in search of the adventurers at the same second. Nagi heard the stomping and growling and warned the others that the army was approaching. He asked Stoneman and Naines to stand behind him. The adventurers did not argue and did what they were told. Nagi stretched ropes across the hall and attached explosive mushrooms to them. As soon as the first zombie's foot caught the rope, a very powerful explosion occurred due to a chain reaction with the rest of the mushrooms. Everything around was covered in smoke and fine dust from the destroyed walls. The adventurers remained where they were, waiting for something to go wrong. Nines noted the delicious smell that appeared, but Nagi asked him not to inhale it. Then he turned to Gluttony and asked if he was ready to act. Gluttony asked Nagi if he was sure the plan would work, and the courier simply told him not to worry. He said that he would take aim and held his bag out with the neck forward, reminding Gluttony that all that was left was to shoot. Silhouettes of zombies began to appear in the smoke, approaching the adventurers. Soon their faces were clearly visible as they came much closer. Nagi grabbed the bag tighter and pointed the barrel at the zombie. Gluttony was ready and waiting for the right moment to shoot. Nagi handed him a crossbow, which he was supposed to use to aim at the zombies. But besides Gluttony, there was a whole army of monsters in the bag that had remained there from the chest with the reward. Each of them also had a crossbow. Gluttony shouted that it was time for the monsters to earn their food and gestured for them to shoot. A huge number of arrows rained down from Nagi's bag, immediately finding their targets ahead. This was another new invention of the courier, which distinguished him from the rest of the massive porters. This plan was successfully implemented there, and most importantly, it was very effective. The arrows pierced the zombies' bodies, preventing them from advancing further and causing them to fall asleep for a while. Nines, who was still standing there blindfolded, asked what was going on there, and Stoneman replied that there was a massacre. The hall was in chaos. It was hard to understand what was really happening on the battlefield. Arrows whistled, zombies growled and groaned as they fell with a crash. Nagi held his stance, directing the stream of arrows where it was most needed. And finding that they had defeated most of the armies, he commanded the remaining adventurers to run forward and break into the boss's hall.